Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just that one tired corner of the room where you always seem to end up when the day has finally run out of things to ask from you. Tonight we're going somewhere that is not usually treated like a battlefield, even though in its own way it became one. Not to a trench in France, not to a factory floor roaring with machines, not to a Senate hearing room filled with cameras and raised hands, though we will pass through all of those places eventually. Tonight we're going to follow a small white paper tube about the length of a finger, filled with shredded tobacco, cheap enough to give away, easy enough to light in the wind, and powerful enough to change how an entire country breathed. That is the strange thing about cigarettes. They do not look like the sort of object that should have a national history. A train has a history. A war has a history. A president, a city, a great migration, a machine, a law, a movement. All of those feel large enough to deserve attention. But a cigarette looks too small. It is easy to miss how completely it entered American life, because it did not arrive all at once like an army marching over a hill. It slipped in through coat pockets, lunch breaks, kitchen tables, factory gates, army camps, barbershops, hospital waiting rooms, movie screens, baseball dugouts, beauty counters, airplanes, diners, and office desks. It entered with a flick of a match and a little curl of smoke, and after a while, it was everywhere. By the middle of the 20th century, America was not just a country where many people smoked. It was a country arranged around smoking. Ashtrays sat on restaurant tables the way salt and pepper did. Doctors kept cigarettes in desk drawers. Movie stars held them between two fingers, as if they were part of the human hand. Soldiers received them in packages from home. Advertisements promised calm, confidence, flavour, courage, friendship, romance, thinness, masculinity, glamour, sophistication, and a better throat. Office workers smoked while typing. Parents smoked in cars with the windows barely cracked. People smoked in hospitals, in elevators, in college classrooms, in airplanes where the cabin air turned faintly blue over the ocean. There were smoking sections, smoking lounges, smoking cars, smoking breaks, smoking jackets, smoking stands, smoking advertisements, smoking songs, and smoking jokes. The cigarette became so normal that for millions of Americans, not smoking was the thing that needed explaining. And here is what makes this story worth staying with. Cigarettes did not take over America because Americans suddenly became careless or foolish, or because one generation woke up and decided it wanted to fill every room with smoke. That would be too simple, and history is almost never that simple. Cigarettes took over because they arrived at the exact meeting point of machinery, war, advertising, modern anxiety, mass entertainment, corporate power, and a country learning to move faster than it ever had before. They were portable in a newly mobile nation. They were cheap in a country becoming more consumer-driven. They were quick in a century obsessed with speed. They were private but also social. They gave the hand something to do, the mouth something to repeat, the nervous system something to expect. And perhaps most importantly, they were sold to Americans not merely as tobacco, but as a way to be a certain kind of person. That is the part I want you to sit with for a moment. A cigarette was rarely presented as just a cigarette. In one decade, it was a soldier's comfort. In another, a businessman's pause. In another, a woman's symbol of independence. In another, a movie star's punctuation mark at the end of a line. It could mean toughness, calm, adulthood, rebellion, patriotism, elegance, or ordinary belonging, depending on who was holding it and who was watching. If you were young, it could make you look older. If you were tired, it promised relief. If you were lonely, it gave you something to share. If you were afraid, it gave you something to do with your hands. That is a lot of meaning to pack into a little paper cylinder that turned into ash in less than 10 minutes. So tonight, Before we get to the factories and the cigarette machines and the soldiers in muddy uniforms and the glossy magazine ads with smiling doctors, I want to begin with a quieter question. When did smoking become normal? Not legal, not available, not known. Normal. When did it become something people did without thinking? Something that belonged beside the telephone and the coffee cup and the evening newspaper? When did it stop looking strange to see a cigarette in a mother's hand, a doctor's hand, a teenager's hand, a pilot's hand, a president's hand? When did the smoke become part of the room? Maybe you remember some of that world yourself. Maybe you grew up in a house where an ashtray sat on the coffee table, heavy glass, amber or green, always somehow dusty even when it was clean. Maybe you remember the smell of cigarette smoke in a grandparent's sweater, in the upholstery of an old car, in a restaurant lobby, in the curtains of a motel room, in the pages of a used book. Maybe you're too young to remember smoking sections on airplanes, but old enough to remember when restaurants still asked, smoking or non-smoking? As if air could be divided that neatly. Maybe cigarettes are not part of your life at all, and the world we're about to enter already feels distant, almost unbelievable. A world where a doctor might recommend a brand, where a cartoon character could sell tobacco, where a television host could interview a guest through a cloud of smoke, and no one thought to open a window. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a bedroom, on a couch, at a desk, in a quiet kitchen after everyone else has gone to sleep? Is the window open? Is there traffic outside? Is there rain? I always like imagining all the different rooms where these stories land, because history is easier to feel when it is not treated as something sealed behind glass. It was lived by people sitting in rooms just like you are, tired after work, worried about money, proud of small things, embarrassed by others, looking for comfort where they could find it. And for much of the 20th century, one of the most common comforts in American life came wrapped in paper, tucked inside a soft pack or a hard pack, waiting for the scratch of a match. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy these slow walks through the ordinary corners of the past, it would mean the world to me if you hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something here makes you pause or remember, or feel that quiet pull that history sometimes has when it stops being a list of dates and becomes a room you can almost stand inside. And if you want to tell me where you are listening from tonight, or whether cigarettes were part of the world you grew up in, leave it in the comments. I do read those, and it is always striking how one small historical object can bring back 1,000 different memories. Now let us begin before the cigarette became king, because America had a tobacco habit long before it had a cigarette habit. In the 1800s, tobacco was already deeply woven into American life, but it usually appeared in different forms. Men chewed tobacco while working, talking, riding, waiting, bargaining and spitting. Spittoons sat in saloons, hotel lobbies, courtrooms, railroad stations, and even respectable public buildings, because chewing tobacco created a constant need to dispose of what the mouth could not keep. Pipes were common. Cigars carried their own meanings, especially among men with money or men who wanted to look as though they had it. Tobacco was familiar, profitable, and American in a very old sense. It had been cultivated in Virginia since the colonial period. It had shaped plantations, labour systems, trade routes, fortunes, and politics. But the cigarette, for much of the 19th century, was still a smaller thing, a little foreign-looking, associated more with parts of Europe, Latin America, and certain urban circles than with the broad centre of American life. It is important to understand that early cigarettes were not yet the smooth, perfectly uniform products that would later pour out of factories by the millions. Many were rolled by hand. That made them slower to produce and more expensive than they would eventually become. They were delicate, a little fussy, and not yet the obvious choice for a nation used to chewing, smoking pipes or taking time with cigars. A cigar had weight. A pipe had ritual. Chewing tobacco had rough practicality. A cigarette, in comparison, could seem slight, almost suspiciously quick. It was not yet the symbol of modern America. It was waiting for modern America to become the kind of place that needed it. And that is one of the keys to this whole story. The cigarette did not merely become popular because someone invented a better way to sell tobacco. It became popular because the country around it changed. Americans moved into cities. Work became more scheduled, more supervised, more tied to clocks and shifts. Leisure became more commercial. Advertising became more sophisticated. Magazines reached millions. Movies turned gestures into national habits. Railroads, streetcars, automobiles, and later airplanes changed how people occupied time. The old pipe could be too slow for a 5-minute pause outside a factory door. A cigar could be too heavy, too expensive, too lingering. Chewing tobacco was messy, especially in the cleaner, more regulated, more image-conscious spaces of the new century. But a cigarette fit. It was small. It was fast. It was finished quickly. It could be offered, accepted, shared, lit, smoked, and discarded in the space between one obligation and the next. That sounds ordinary, but it mattered enormously. The 20th century created millions of little gaps in American life. The pause before a train, the walk between buildings, the break between factory shifts, the moment after dinner, the 10 minutes outside an office, the moment when a soldier waited for orders. The cigarette filled those gaps perfectly. It gave shape to waiting. It made nervous stillness look intentional. A person with nothing to do could look awkward. A person smoking looked occupied. There is a small social magic in that, and the tobacco companies understood it early. A cigarette could turn silence into a shared ritual. Someone took out a pack. Someone offered one. Someone asked for a light. A match flared. People leaned in. Conversation began, or did not need to begin. The gesture itself did the work. In a society where Americans were increasingly surrounded by strangers in cities, offices, military camps, trains and public places, the cigarette became one of the easiest ways to make contact without intimacy. It was a little bridge made of paper and smoke, but none of this would have happened at the scale it did without a machine. Not an especially romantic machine, not the kind that becomes famous in schoolbooks, but one of those inventions that quietly rearranges daily life by making something cheap enough to become invisible. In the early 1880s, a young inventor named James Bonsack developed a machine that could roll cigarettes far faster than human hands. Before machines like his, a skilled worker might roll a few cigarettes in a minute. The Bonsack machine could produce thousands in an hour once refined and properly operated. It pulled tobacco into a continuous paper tube, shaped it, pasted it, cut it, and delivered uniform cigarettes with a speed that changed the economics of smoking. That was the moment the cigarette began to become something else. Not just a tobacco product, but a mass product. Not merely rolled, but manufactured. Not occasional, but abundant. When production costs dropped, prices could drop. When prices dropped, more people could buy. When more people bought, companies had more reason to advertise. When advertising grew, demand grew. And when demand grew, the cigarette moved from the edge of American tobacco culture toward the centre. The man who saw the future most clearly was James Buchanan Duke, often called Buck Duke, a North Carolina tobacco businessman with the instincts of a gambler and the discipline of a factory accountant. Duke understood that the machine was not just a tool for making cigarettes. It was a tool for conquering markets. A machine that produced huge quantities created a new problem. You had to sell huge quantities. That meant advertising, distribution, branding, and price competition on a scale that older tobacco businesses had not fully imagined. Duke embraced it. He leased Bonsack machines, drove down costs, pushed cigarettes into more markets, and poured money into promotion. In time, his company became part of the American Tobacco Company, one of the great trusts of the Gilded Age, powerful enough to dominate the industry and draw the attention of antitrust authorities. It is tempting to make Duke into the villain at the beginning of the story, and in some ways that is understandable. But history is more useful when we look carefully at what people actually did and why their moment allowed them to do it. Duke did not create American restlessness. He did not create urban life, mass advertising, industrial capitalism, or the desire for cheap pleasure. But he recognised that the cigarette could ride all of those forces at once. He saw that a product small enough to fit in the pocket could become enormous if it was made cheaply, distributed widely, and wrapped in the right idea. That last part, the idea, became as important as the tobacco itself. A cigarette pack was not just packaging. It was identity in the palm. Brands developed personalities. Some were refined, some rugged, some youthful, some soothing, some masculine, some later carefully aimed at women. Coupons, trading cards, colourful labels, slogans, and magazine ads helped make cigarettes feel familiar before a person even bought them. Tobacco companies learned to sell repetition. The same brand name seen again and again in newspapers, on signs, in shop windows, on billboards, in magazines, at the counter, in the hand of someone admired. Familiarity became trust. Trust became habit. Still, the cigarette had obstacles. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, plenty of Americans considered cigarettes immoral, unhealthy, foreign, juvenile, or associated with vice. Some reformers saw them as corrupting young men. Others worried they weakened the body or damaged character. Several states passed restrictions or bans on cigarette sales in different forms during the Progressive era. There were anti-cigarette campaigns, moral warnings, and civic efforts to stop boys from taking up the habit. The cigarette's victory was not inevitable. It had enemies, and some of those enemies were loud. But cigarettes had one advantage that reformers struggled to defeat. They were convenient. Convenience is one of the most powerful forces in modern history, because it rarely announces itself as an ideology. It simply waits in the pocket. A pipe had to be packed, lit, cleaned, and carried. A cigar took time. Chewing tobacco required spitting. A cigarette was ready almost immediately. In a century that increasingly rewarded speed, convenience could look like freedom. And in a country where small pleasures were often the most available pleasures, cigarettes offered a cheap, repeatable comfort that fit into nearly every class of life. Think about a young man in an American city around 1905. He works long hours. Maybe he boards in a rooming house. Maybe he eats at a lunch counter. Maybe he has little privacy, little money, and not much control over his day. A cigarette costs little. It gives him a pause, a sensation, a gesture, maybe a little confidence. Now think about a travelling salesman waiting at a station, a factory worker outside a door, a clerk at the end of a shift, a college student trying to look grown, a group of men leaving a baseball game. The cigarette travelled easily through all these lives because it did not ask for much. It did not require a special room. It did not require a long conversation. It did not require wealth. It only required a match and permission, and for a long time, American society gave that permission almost everywhere. There was also the matter of time. Cigarettes suited a culture that was learning to divide the day into smaller units. The industrial clock had already changed work. Trains had changed schedules. Offices, schools, and factories made time more measurable and less flexible. A cigarette became a unit of time itself. People spoke of having a smoke, taking a smoke, stepping out for a smoke. The object and the break became almost the same thing. A cigarette could measure 5 minutes of relief more clearly than a clock could. That does not mean people understood what was happening to them in any grand historical sense. Most smokers did not think, I am participating in the rise of a mass consumer tobacco culture shaped by mechanized production and national advertising. They thought, I want a cigarette. That is how history often works at ground level. Large forces move through ordinary wants. A corporation sees a market. a machine increases supply, an advertisement shapes desire, a war normalizes use, a movie glamorizes the gesture, a person reaches into a pocket. By the time the United States entered the First World War in 1917, cigarettes were already growing in popularity, but the war would give them a new emotional role. They became associated with soldiers, endurance, fear, boredom, and comfort under pressure. But before we walk into the army camps and the trenches and the care packages sent across the Atlantic, it matters that we understand the cigarette had already been prepared for that moment. The factories were ready, the brands existed, the advertising networks were in place, the habit was spreading. The cigarette was no longer a curiosity, but it had not yet become unavoidable. America stood at the edge of the 20th century with tobacco in its history, machines in its factories, cities filling with workers, magazines filling with advertisements, and millions of people learning to live by the clock. The cigarette fit that world so neatly that it almost seemed designed by the century itself. It was quick, cheap, portable, branded, repeatable, and easy to share. It could be sold as comfort, style, strength, or escape. It was small enough to be ignored and profitable enough to build empires around. And soon, as American soldiers crossed the ocean and carried cigarettes into the daily routine of war, that little white stick would gain something even more powerful than convenience. It would gain the image of necessity. Before the cigarette could take over America, it had to defeat an older America, one with stained floors, brass spittoons, clay pipes, cigar smoke in hotel lobbies, and men carrying tobacco in pouches the way later generations would carry a pack of cigarettes. This was a country that already knew tobacco well. It did not need to be introduced to the plant. It had grown rich from it, argued over it, taxed it, planted it, exported it, chewed it, smoked it, praised it, condemned it, and cleaned up after it for more than 2 centuries before the cigarette became the small white symbol of modern life. That is why the rise of the cigarette is not the story of tobacco arriving in America. It is the story of tobacco changing shape. To understand that change, we have to enter a world where tobacco was slower, heavier, messier, and more public than the cigarette would later be. In the 1800s, the ordinary American tobacco habit was not yet the quick motion of tapping a cigarette from a pack and lighting it in one practiced gesture. It was a plug of chewing tobacco tucked into the cheek. It was a pipe packed carefully at the end of a day. It was a cigar clipped, rolled between the fingers, and smoked with enough time to finish it. It was snuff in earlier generations, taken in ways that now feel almost ceremonial. Tobacco was everywhere, but it occupied the body and the room differently. It required more equipment, more patience, more cleaning, and often more tolerance from everyone nearby. The old American relationship with tobacco began long before the cigarette age, and it began in the soil. In colonial Virginia, tobacco became the crop that turned an uncertain English settlement into a profitable colony. John Rolfe's introduction of a milder Nicotiana tabacum variety in 1612 helped make Virginia tobacco desirable in England, and tobacco soon became the colony's great cash crop. By 1640, London was importing nearly 1.5 million pounds of tobacco a year from Virginia, a figure that tells you how quickly this plant moved from curiosity to commercial foundation. That matters because Americans did not come to tobacco as casual consumers only. Tobacco was built into the economic memory of the country. It was part of plantation agriculture. It was part of Atlantic trade. It was tied to enslaved labour, land hunger, credit, debt, and the fortunes of families who measured their lives in hogsheads of leaf. Before the cigarette ever sat in a corner store display, tobacco had already shaped landscapes and labour systems. It had already trained Americans to think of the plant as both crop and commodity, both personal pleasure and public business. When later tobacco companies sold cigarettes by the billions, they were not building on empty ground. They were building on one of the oldest commercial habits in American history. But the tobacco of the 19th century was not mainly cigarette tobacco. If you walked through an American town in the decades after the Civil War, the signs of tobacco use would have been physical and hard to ignore. You would see tobacco shops with carved figures outside, the famous cigar store Indians that stood as commercial symbols for tobacco sellers. You would see men with cigars in front of hotels, men with pipes near stoves, men chewing as they leaned on counters or waited for trains. You would also see spittoons, and you would smell them before you wanted to. They were necessary because chewing tobacco was not a discrete habit. It produced saliva, and that saliva had to go somewhere. This is one of those details that makes the past feel less tidy than the version preserved in paintings. The 19th century was not a clean sepia photograph. It was full of mud, coal smoke, horse manure, sweat, kerosene, pipe smoke, cigar smoke, and tobacco spit. Spittoons sat in saloons, courthouses, railroad stations, hotel lobbies, shops, offices, and government buildings. They were not marginal objects. They were part of the furnishings of public life. The United States House of Representatives has even documented the presence of elaborate ceramic spittoons in the Speaker's offices in the 1870s, which is a useful reminder that chewing tobacco belonged not only to rough frontier caricatures, but to respectable political rooms as well. Now pause with that image for a moment. A high public office, heavy furniture, formal manners, important men coming and going, and on either side of the desk spittoons, not hidden, not embarrassing, expected. That tells us something about the kind of tobacco culture America had before cigarettes. It was male, public, and physically obvious. Chewing tobacco made the body participate in a way that could not be made elegant. It stained the mouth. It required spitting. It marked floors and sidewalks when spittoons were ignored, which they often were. Reformers complained about it. Travellers noticed it. Housekeepers hated it. Yet the habit persisted because for many men it was practical, familiar, and tied to work. Chewing tobacco fit a country of farms, workshops, stables, rail lines, mills, and outdoor labour. You did not need a match. You did not need to stop what you were doing. You could take a piece of plug tobacco, cut or bite it, hold it in the cheek, and continue with your hands free. A pipe required lighting. A cigar required attention. A cigarette before mass production was still too delicate and uncommon to be the default. But chew worked while ploughing, riding, hammering, gambling, arguing, or waiting. It was not refined, but it was useful. A person could chew through a long shift or a long ride. In a country still tied closely to physical work that mattered, there is a tendency today to imagine old tobacco habits as leisurely, as if every pipe smoker sat beside a fireplace and every cigar smoker leaned back in a leather chair. Some did, many did not. Tobacco was often woven into fatigue. It was used while standing, hauling, bargaining, watching livestock, loading freight, or sitting through long travel delays. It gave the mouth something to do during hours when the body was already committed to work. And because tobacco use was so common among men, it also became a form of social language. Offering tobacco could be a gesture of friendliness. Sharing a light for a pipe or cigar could open conversation. Sitting near a stove in a country store with tobacco in the cheek was not merely consumption, it was participation. Pipes belonged to a different rhythm. A pipe had to be packed. The tobacco had to be kept dry enough to burn well. The bowl had to be lit, sometimes relit and cleaned. There was skill in it, and there was also identity. A pipe suggested habit, steadiness, sometimes age, sometimes thoughtfulness, sometimes plain economy. Loose tobacco could be carried in a pouch and stretched over time. A pipe did not vanish in minutes the way a cigarette did. It stayed with a person. It was an object owned and broken in, held in the teeth, left on a mantle, knocked against a boot heel, passed down, or replaced only when necessary. It belonged to the slower world that cigarettes would help displace. In that older world, a pipe also made sense because evenings were longer and less distracted by modern entertainment. A man could sit with a pipe after supper, not because he was posing for a tobacco advertisement, but because the evening itself moved at the pace of the fire, the newspaper, the porch, the stove, the conversation. A pipe did not suit a quick break between telephone calls. It suited a period when people expected certain things to take time. Even the act of lighting it had a small ritual built into it. Press the tobacco, draw the flame, puff carefully, adjust, settle. A cigarette later reduced this ceremony almost to nothing. That reduction would become one of its great advantages. Cigars carried still another meaning. They were stronger in smell, larger in presence, and more associated with status, celebration, masculine sociability, and sometimes power. A cigar could be cheap and rough, smoked by working men and sold widely, but it could also be expensive and symbolic. It belonged in political cartoons, club rooms, back rooms, hotels, and after-dinner scenes. Cigar smoke had weight. It lingered. It announced itself. A cigar was not usually something one smoked quickly while walking from one obligation to another. It asked for time, and if the cigar was good, it asked for attention. That made it useful as a social object in a different way. To offer a cigar could mean hospitality. To smoke one could mean success, confidence, or at least the wish to project those things. The cigar also had a labour history behind it. Cigars were handwork before they were mass work, and cigar making required skill. In the late 19th century, cigar factories and tenement production employed large numbers of workers, including immigrants, who rolled tobacco leaf into products that still carried a sense of craft. The cigar trade produced unions, strikes, and shop cultures. In some cigar shops, workers listened while someone read newspapers or literature aloud, a tradition especially associated with Cuban and immigrant cigar-making communities. The product that reached the smoker's hand carried with it a human chain of cultivation, curing, sorting, stripping, rolling, boxing, labelling, and selling. The cigarette would not eliminate labour, but it would alter its scale and visibility. It would move tobacco toward a more automatic, standardised, machine-fed world. That difference between hand and machine is important. A hand-rolled cigar was individual in a way a machine-made cigarette would not be. Even cheap cigars had variation. The smoker saw the leaf. The wrapper mattered. The smell was dense and organic. The cigarette, by contrast, would become clean-looking, uniform and modern. It hid the shredded tobacco inside white paper. It looked less like a plant and more like a manufactured unit. That mattered psychologically. A cigar reminded you of tobacco leaf. A pipe bowl showed you loose tobacco. Chewing tobacco came in plugs, twists, or cuts that still looked close to the raw material. A cigarette concealed the plant inside packaging and design. It made tobacco smoother to imagine. Before that happened, tobacconists and manufacturers sold a much wider field of products. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History holds extensive tobacco advertising collections that include chewing tobacco, pipes, cigar bands, cigarette materials, lighters, and other smoking-related advertising, which reflects how broad the tobacco market was before cigarettes became dominant. Tobacco was not one thing in the American marketplace. It was many products, each with its own customers, rituals and social meanings. A man who chewed plug tobacco was not necessarily the same kind of consumer as the man who purchased fine cigars. A pipe smoker might look at cigarettes with suspicion. A cigar smoker might see them as flimsy. A mother might tolerate a husband's pipe but object to a son's cigarette. These distinctions mattered. In fact, early cigarettes had a reputation problem. They were often viewed as foreign, urban, immature, or morally questionable. Some Americans associated them with boys, idlers, immigrants, gamblers, or people who seemed too fashionable for their own good. Anti-cigarette reformers warned that cigarettes weakened young men, damaged discipline, and encouraged vice. This was not yet the age when a cigarette in the hand of a movie hero would seem natural. It could look suspicious. The cigarette's smallness worked against it at first. In a culture that respected heavy male objects like cigars, pipes, tools, boots, rifles and pocket watches, the cigarette looked thin and temporary. It did not yet carry authority. That suspicion was connected to gender as well. In the 19th century and into the early 20th, respectable women were generally not supposed to smoke in public. Women did use tobacco in various forms in earlier periods, including snuff, and private behaviour was always more complicated than public rules. But the visible public act of a woman smoking a cigarette carried a social charge. Later, advertisers would turn that charge into a selling point, presenting cigarettes as signs of modern freedom and female independence. But before that transformation, a woman smoking openly could be treated as disreputable or shocking. The National Library of Medicine notes that smoking by women was originally considered a sign of disrepute before glamorous images, and advertising helped change its meaning in the 1920s. So the cigarette entered a culture where tobacco was accepted, but cigarettes were not automatically respectable. That sounds contradictory, but it is exactly the kind of contradiction history often gives us. A man could chew tobacco in a courthouse, and no one would think America had collapsed. The same man might see a teenage boy with a cigarette and consider it a sign of moral decline. The issue was not simply tobacco, it was form, age, setting, gender and meaning. Cigarettes would eventually win because they learned to change those meanings one by one. Before they could do that, the older tobacco habits had to reveal their weaknesses. Chewing tobacco was messy. As towns became more concerned with sanitation and public order, spitting became harder to defend. Health reformers, women's groups and civic authorities increasingly objected to the filth of public spitting, especially as medical understanding of contagious disease grew. Spittoons were provided partly because people knew the alternative was worse, but their presence was also an admission that the habit created a public problem. His cigarette produced ash and smoke, certainly, but compared with chewing tobacco it could seem cleaner, at least to the standards of the time. That perception would become useful. Pipes were slower. They belonged to routine, but not always to speed. As the new century approached, more Americans worked in settings where time was divided into shorter breaks and more controlled intervals. Factories, offices, department stores and rail schedules created a world where a person might have only a few minutes. A pipe was possible, but less convenient. It had to be packed and tended. A cigarette could be consumed in the exact size of the new pores. That was not a small advantage. It made cigarettes compatible with modern time. Cigars had their own limitations. They could be expensive, strong-smelling, and too slow for everyday repeated use by many people. Cheap cigars existed, of course, and cigar consumption remained important, but cigars did not fit every pocket or every moment. A cigar was a statement. A cigarette could become a habit. A cigar might belong after dinner, after a deal, during a card game, on a walk, or in a saloon. A cigarette could belong before breakfast, after breakfast, between meetings, before a train, after a train, while waiting, while talking, while pretending not to wait. It was more flexible, and flexibility is one of the quiet engines of mass adoption. There is something else to notice here. The older forms of tobacco made the user wait. A pipe asked to be prepared. A cigar asked to be finished slowly. Chewing tobacco asked the body to tolerate its taste and manage its byproduct. The cigarette removed friction. It made tobacco easier to start and easier to repeat. That is why convenience becomes so important in this story. A habit that is easy to begin, easy to carry, easy to share, and easy to repeat has a different future from one that requires more effort. Once the cigarette became cheap enough, it did not have to persuade every pipe smoker and cigar smoker that it was better in some grand sense. It only had to be easier at the right moment. Still, the older world did not disappear overnight. For decades, the cigarette rose alongside pipes, chew, and cigars. Men continued to chew. Cigar smoke still filled political and business spaces. Pipes remained common in homes, shops, and campuses. A person living around 1900 could see all these tobacco cultures at once. That overlap matters because it reminds us that history does not usually flip like a switch. It layers. A father might smoke a pipe while his son experimented with cigarettes. A businessman might keep cigars for clients and cigarettes for quick use. A rural worker might chew during the day and smoke at night. The cigarette did not replace the older forms by argument. It surrounded them with convenience, price, advertising, and repetition until the balance shifted. Imagine a general store in the late 19th century. The floorboards are worn near the counter. There are sacks of flour, tins of crackers, bolts of cloth, kerosene cans, harness pieces, patent medicines, and tobacco products arranged where customers can see them. Men come in from the road or from nearby farms. One asks for plug tobacco, another buys pipe tobacco, another chooses cigars. Someone spits into a metal or ceramic spittoon near the stove. The air holds a layered smell of smoke, leather, dust, molasses, sweat, and damp wool. Now imagine, somewhere in that store, a newer product begins to appear more insistently. Small packages, uniform, branded, easy to carry. The cigarette is not yet the room's master, but it is present, and it has a quality the older forms do not have. It looks like the future because it looks manufactured. That word, manufactured, is doing a great deal of work. Americans in the late 19th century were becoming surrounded by standardized products. Canned goods, packaged cereals, factory-made clothing, branded soap, patent medicines, mail-order goods, and mass-produced household items were changing the way people bought and trusted things. A product did not have to be made locally or personally known to be desirable. A brand could stand in for trust. Packaging could create familiarity. Advertising could make a name feel reliable. Cigarettes benefited from this wider transformation. The neat package did not just hold tobacco. It held a promise that each cigarette would be like the last one. That was modern. The older tobacco forms were not without branding, of course. Chewing tobacco had labels, cigar boxes had artwork, pipe tobacco had tins and names. Tobacco sellers had long understood the importance of presentation, but cigarettes were especially well suited to the new advertising culture because they were bought frequently and consumed quickly. A person who bought a pipe might keep it for years. A person who bought a cigar might remember the occasion. A person who bought cigarettes came back again and again. That repeat purchase made brand loyalty extremely valuable. Once a smoker chose a cigarette brand, the company had a daily customer, sometimes a many times a day customer. The older tobacco world had customers. The cigarette industry would learn how to create routines. At the level of daily life, this shift was easy to miss. No one would have stood in that store and announced that America was passing from the age of chew and pipe into the age of cigarettes. People simply bought what suited them. They followed friends. They copied older boys. They tried what was cheap. They accepted what was offered. They responded to signs and cards and counter displays. They adjusted to workplaces where a quick smoke fit better than a pipe. They moved through cities where cigarettes were easier to carry than a plug and less socially awkward than spitting. The future often arrives as a small convenience that seems too minor to resist. And yet, beneath all of this, there was still the older moral unease. Cigarettes had critics because they seemed to make tobacco too easy. That criticism was sharper than it might first appear. Reformers understood, even if they used different language, that a product requiring little effort could spread rapidly among the young. Boys could hide cigarettes more easily than pipes or cigars. They could smoke quickly in alleys, behind buildings, near schoolyards, or on errands. Cigarettes were cheap enough to buy with small coins. That made them frightening to parents and teachers, who saw them not as adult indulgences, but as traps for children. The same qualities that would make cigarettes successful as a mass product also made them look dangerous to reformers. The cigarette companies would eventually answer that moral problem not by making cigarettes seem less convenient, but by making them seem more adult, more stylish, more patriotic, more scientific, and more normal. That would take time. It would require wars, advertisements, doctors, movie stars, and a careful reshaping of public meaning. But in the period before cigarettes took command, the central contest was already visible. On one side stood the older tobacco culture, heavy with habit, mess, ritual, and masculine tradition. On the other stood the cigarette, still contested, still sometimes disapproved of, but perfectly adapted to a country becoming faster, more urban, more branded, and more comfortable with disposable things. That is the quiet hinge of the story. Cigarettes did not defeat pipes, chew, and cigars, because those older forms suddenly vanished from American life. They defeated them because the cigarette matched the new century better than they did. It matched the lunch break. It matched the crowded sidewalk. It matched the magazine advertisement. It matched the soldier's ration, the actress's photograph, the office worker's desk, the driver's hand, the diner counter, the factory gate. The older tobacco habits belonged to a world where time was heavier and objects lasted longer. The cigarette belonged to a world where everything was becoming quicker, smaller, cheaper, and more repeatable. So when we picture America before the cigarette, we should not picture a tobacco-free country waiting innocently to be corrupted. We should picture a country already saturated with tobacco, but in forms that carried different rules. A country where men spat into public vessels without apology. A country where a pipe could mark the end of a day. A country where a cigar could signal status, celebration, or political confidence. A country where tobacco was familiar enough to be ordinary, but cigarettes were still fighting for respectability. The cigarette's genius, if we can use that word for something so harmful, was that it did not ask Americans to accept tobacco. They had already done that. It only asked them to accept tobacco in a form better suited to modern life. And once that form could be made not by careful hands at a slow table, but by a machine that rolled, pasted, cut, and counted faster than any worker could dream of doing, the small white stick stopped being merely another tobacco product. It became an industrial object. And industrial objects have a way of changing habits at a speed that older customs cannot match. The world of pipes, chew, and cigars was still there, still loud, still smoky, still staining floors and filling rooms. But in the factories of the 1880s, something new was beginning to move with a rhythm no human hand could keep up with. The machine did not look like the kind of thing that could change the air of an entire country. It was not tall like a steam engine, not loud like a locomotive, not dramatic like a factory press slamming iron into shape. It was a cigarette-making machine, built to do one small job over and over again with a steadiness no human hand could match. Feed in tobacco, feed in paper. Shape the tube, paste the seam, cut it to length, count the finished cigarettes, repeat, repeat, repeat. That was the simple mechanical rhythm at the centre of one of the largest habit changes in American history. Before that machine, cigarettes were still held back by the limits of the hand. A skilled cigarette roller could work quickly, but quickly still meant human speed. In Durham, North Carolina, in the early 1880s, James Buchanan Duke hired skilled Eastern European Jewish immigrant workers who had learned cigarette rolling in Europe and New York. They could roll 3 or 4 cigarettes a minute, and by 1883 those workers were producing about 250,000 cigarettes a day for W. Duke, Sons and Company. That was impressive work. It was fast, skilled, repetitive labour. But it was still labour measured by fingers, eyesight, muscle memory and fatigue. Then Duke learned of the Bonsack machine, which could theoretically roll in one day what dozens of workers could produce by hand. I want you to picture that hand-rolling room for a moment, because this is where the change becomes more human than mechanical. Imagine long tables, tobacco leaf prepared and cut, paper stacked and waiting. Workers bent over their stations, their fingers moving with the speed that comes only from doing one task thousands of times. The smell would have been dense and dry and sweet in the way cured tobacco can be. The work required precision. Too much tobacco and the cigarette would be uneven. Too little, and it would feel cheap. The paper had to close neatly. The finished cigarette had to look like something a customer would buy. Every cigarette was small, but each one took attention. Now imagine someone brings in a machine that does not care about tired hands, sore wrists, daylight, pride, tradition, or the pace of the body. It is not better because it understands the work. It is better because it does not understand anything at all. That is the unsettling power of industrial machinery. It can do a task without feeling the cost of doing it. The Bonsack machine was patented in 1881 by James A. Bonsack of Virginia, and in the patent description its purpose was laid out plainly. The machine would feed tobacco onto a continuous ribbon of paper, form it into a continuous roll, paste the paper around it, and cut it into definite lengths. Bonsack wrote that in practical operation it had shown a capacity of 100,000 cigarettes in a 10-hour day. Read that number slowly. 100,000 cigarettes in a day from a machine, doing what had recently required rows of trained workers. Later accounts of the Bonsack device often put its speed at about 200 cigarettes per minute, roughly 60 times faster than a skilled hand roller. The exact numbers varied depending on the condition of the machine, the skill of the mechanics, and how well the operation was running, but the central fact does not change. The machine broke the old relationship between labour and output. It made cigarettes cheap enough and plentiful enough to become something new. There is a line in the history of consumer goods where a product crosses from being available to being everywhere. That line is usually not crossed by desire alone. People may want something, but wanting does not make it common if the object is slow to produce and expensive to buy. The machine changes the terms. It makes abundance possible. Once abundance exists, sellers have to create demand large enough to absorb it. That is when advertising grows louder. That is when price wars begin. That is when distribution matters. That is when a small object becomes part of everyday life, not because each individual person made a dramatic decision, but because the entire system around that person began placing the object within reach again and again. James Buchanan, Duke understood this better than nearly anyone around him. He was not the inventor of the cigarette. He was not the inventor of the machine. He inherited a tobacco business from a family already involved in the trade, but he had a particular genius for seeing that production, pricing, branding, and advertising were not separate things. They were one machine, larger than the Bonsack machine itself. The metal machine made the cigarettes. The business machine made the smokers. Duke's competitors were not all eager to embrace machine-made cigarettes at first. That is important, because hindsight makes everything look obvious. The machine could break down. Customers might reject cigarettes that looked too uniform, too mechanical, too unlike the hand-rolled product they knew. Some manufacturers worried that people would see machine-made cigarettes as inferior. That kind of anxiety appears again and again in industrial history. A machine can make more, but will customers trust what it makes? Will they think it is cheap in the wrong way? Will they miss the human touch? Duke's answer was direct. If the machine could be made to work and if the price could be brought down, customers could be persuaded. He did not merely install the machines and hope. He worked with mechanics. He improved operations. He negotiated advantages. According to North Carolina history material on the Bonsack machine, companies were reluctant because consumers were believed to prefer hand-rolled cigarettes and because the machine often broke down. But Duke got help from a Bonsack mechanic, made the machine function more reliably, and arranged to obtain machines at a cheaper rate than competitors. That is the kind of detail that tells you what industrial change really looks like. It is not just invention. It is maintenance. It is bargaining. It is repair. It is the willingness to keep pushing when other people decide the new machine is too troublesome. Think about what this meant inside the factory. At first, the hand rollers were essential. Duke had brought them to Durham because their skill was valuable. Their fingers were the company's productive power. Then the machine arrived and changed the meaning of their skill almost overnight. Some resisted. The mechanic associated with the machine, Tim O'Brien, reportedly received death threats. Workers organised, wrote letters, joined labour groups and tried to protect their position. By the late 1880s, machine production had displaced much of the old hand-rolling labour in Duke's operations. One labour writer complained that machinery was the curse of the labourer, a sentence that could have been written in many industries during that period, not just tobacco. There is a human sadness in that part of the story that should not be rushed past. The cigarette became cheaper for the customer because the work behind it became faster and less dependent on skilled hands. That is the bargain industrial capitalism offered again and again in the late 19th century. More goods for more people, at lower prices, produced in ways that often stripped workers of control and reduced the value of their skill. To the smoker at the counter, the result looked like a bargain. To the worker at the table, it looked like being replaced. And yet for the country as a whole, the bargain was powerful. A cheaper cigarette meant a wider cigarette market. A wider market meant more production. More production meant more aggressive selling. Duke did not wait for Americans to discover cigarettes naturally. He pushed them. He spent heavily on advertising. He used coupons, cards, packaging, brand identity, and price competition. He understood that once a product was cheap enough to be bought repeatedly, the brand could become the habit's address. People did not just smoke tobacco, they smoked a name. This is one of the great shifts in American consumer history. In an older tobacco world, the product was often known by type, place, or seller. A man might buy plug tobacco, loose tobacco, cigars from a familiar shop, or pipe tobacco by habit. In the new cigarette world, the brand name began to matter more intensely because the purchase was frequent and the product was standardized. If every cigarette looked almost the same, the package had to carry the personality. The label had to do emotional work. The pack became a little billboard you could carry in your pocket. The cigarette was especially suited to this because it disappeared so quickly. A durable product may not need constant advertising after it's bought. A chair sits in the home, a coat lasts years, a pipe stays in the pocket or on the mantle, but a cigarette destroys itself in the act of use. Every smoked cigarette creates the need for another one if the habit has taken hold. That made cigarette advertising unusually powerful. The company was not trying to sell one object, it was trying to sell repetition. It was trying to attach a name to a daily rhythm. Duke and his competitors were operating in an America already filling with mass advertising. Newspapers were growing, magazines were becoming national. Lithography made colourful images easier to reproduce. Railroads and wholesalers carried packaged goods across distance. Store counters became places where brands competed for attention. The country was learning to recognise products it had never seen made by people it would never meet. That was a major cultural change. Trust moved from the local maker to the printed label. The cigarette arrived at exactly the right moment to benefit from that shift. The machine also changed the cigarette's appearance. A hand-rolled cigarette could be slightly uneven. It could reveal the speed or carelessness of the person who made it. A machine-made cigarette was uniform. That uniformity could seem suspicious at first, but over time it became a sign of reliability. Each one looked like the next. Each one promised the same size, the same draw, the same quick experience. In a modernising country, sameness could be comforting. It meant control. It meant predictability. It meant that a person in one city could buy a familiar brand and expect it to resemble what he had bought somewhere else. There is something almost strange about how much trust Americans learned to place in uniformity. A thing made by hand could be personal, but it could also vary. A thing made by machine could feel impersonal, but it was dependable. The cigarette took advantage of that new faith. Its whiteness, neatness, and regularity made tobacco look cleaner than it really was. The shredded leaf was hidden. The stained fingers of production were hidden. The agricultural labour was hidden. The curing barns, warehouses, auctions, and factory rooms all disappeared behind a tidy paper cylinder. That neatness mattered because cigarettes were still fighting a reputation problem. Many people in the late 19th century associated them with boys, immigrants, cities, vice, and weakness. A pipe could look respectable. A cigar could look powerful. Chewing tobacco could look rough but familiar. The cigarette had to climb socially. Machine production alone could not do that. If anything, it risked making cigarettes seem cheaper and less respectable. So the industry had to perform a complicated trick. It had to make cigarettes inexpensive without making them feel low. It had to make them common without making them contemptible. Advertising helped solve that problem. So did packaging. So did distribution. So did the steady pressure of seeing cigarettes everywhere. The more people smoked them, the less suspicious they seemed. The less suspicious they seemed, the easier it became for more people to try them. Normality is often built by repetition. 1 cigarette in a room might draw attention. 10 cigarettes in 10 different rooms become the atmosphere of the age. Duke's business expansion was part of a larger transformation in American capitalism. The same decades that produced giant firms in steel, oil, meatpacking, railroads, and finance also produced consolidation in tobacco. In 1890, Duke helped form the American Tobacco Company, and business historians have treated the early history of that company as one of the important examples of the rise of big business in the United States. Britannica summarizes the broad pattern clearly. Bonsack's machine was put into use by Duke, who founded the American Tobacco Company in 1890, and inexpensive mass-produced cigarettes promoted by aggressive marketing helped build mass appeal. That sentence contains almost the whole early story, but it sounds too clean unless we slow it down. Inexpensive, mass-produced cigarettes, aggressive marketing, mass appeal. Each phrase hides people, places, and consequences. Inexpensive meant farmers paid, workers displaced, machinery maintained, prices cut, and competitors squeezed. Mass-produced meant cigarettes by the hundreds of thousands, then millions, then billions. Aggressive marketing meant signs, cards, premiums, newspaper space, spectacle, and the constant effort to make a brand name feel familiar. Mass appeal meant a habit moving outward from particular groups into the wide American public. At the centre of it all was price. Price is not glamorous, but it is often the door through which history enters the house. If cigarettes had remained expensive, they might have stayed a niche product. If they had required careful hand production forever, they could not have become the default smoke of the modern American century. Cheapness did not merely make cigarettes affordable. It made experimentation easy. A young man could try them. A worker could buy them. A person who might hesitate over a more expensive indulgence could justify a pack. Once the habit formed, the small purchase repeated itself until the total cost became far larger than any single decision felt at the moment. That is one of the quietly powerful things about cigarettes as a consumer product. They were cheap at the point of purchase. The cost was divided into small pieces. A pack did not feel like a major expense. A single cigarette felt like almost nothing. The harm, too, was delayed and difficult to see at first. The immediate experience was simple: a light, an inhale, a sensation, a pause. The machine made that immediate experience cheap enough to repeat until it became ordinary. We should also notice how cigarettes fit the changing meaning of work breaks. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrial and office labour created more scheduled interruptions. A cigarette was perfectly sized for those interruptions. A pipe could take too long. A cigar could be too much. Chewing tobacco created mess. A cigarette gave a person 5 minutes that felt marked and complete. The machine did not create the modern workday, but it supplied the modern workday with one of its most common rituals. A factory worker could step outside. A clerk could lean in an alley. A salesman could smoke between calls. A printer, a porter, a mechanic, a driver, a secretary later in the century, a journalist, a police officer, a student, all could use the cigarette to divide time. the cigarette became not just a tobacco product but a punctuation mark in the day. It gave the body a signal that something had paused, even if only briefly, and because it was cheap, it could be shared. Sharing is one of the most important parts of this story. A cigar might be offered on an occasion. A pipe was personal. Chewing tobacco could be shared, but not always elegantly. Cigarettes came in multiples. A pack encouraged offering. You could tap one loose and hand it over. You could ask for one without asking for too much. You could borrow a light. A cigarette made small social exchanges easy, and America in the 20th century would be full of strangers needing small social exchanges. The machine made the cigarette plentiful enough for that casual generosity. If each cigarette had represented too much labour or money, people might have guarded them more carefully. But once they were cheap, offering one became ordinary. That helped spread the habit not only through advertising but through friendship, imitation, politeness, flirtation, and pressure. Many smokers began not with a billboard but with a hand extended toward them holding an open pack. I want to pause on that image because it is one of the simplest ways a national habit moves from industry into the body. A company builds a machine, a factory produces a pack, a wholesaler ships it, a shopkeeper sells it. One person opens it, another person accepts. The machine is now present in a conversation where no one is thinking about machines at all. This is how industrial history becomes intimate. The Bonsack machine was not sitting in the diner, the barracks, the car, the porch, or the theatre lobby. But its work was. Every cheap cigarette carried the machine's logic into ordinary spaces. The smoker did not need to know James Bonsack's name. Most did not. They did not need to know Duke's pricing strategies, labour conflicts, or corporate consolidation. They only needed the product to be available, affordable, and socially legible. Once it was, the machine had done its work. There is a hard truth in this part of the story. The cigarette's later conquest of America depended on making harmful consumption easy, not just possible. Easy. The machine removed difficulty from production. Branding removed uncertainty from purchase. Advertising removed hesitation from desire. Social use removed embarrassment from starting. Price removed the sense of seriousness from the decision. Each removal mattered. Together, they made cigarettes feel less like a choice and more like part of the normal furniture of life. By the early 20th century, the cigarette had not yet reached its full cultural power. That would take war, Hollywood, doctors and advertisements, women's liberation campaigns, radio, television, and decades of corporate messaging. But the foundation had been laid. The older tobacco world of pipes, chew, and cigars still existed. Men still spat, pipes still rested in ashtrays, cigars still marked deals and celebrations. Yet the cigarette had gained something none of those older forms could match at the same scale. It had become industrial. That word does not sound emotional, but it changed everything. Industrial meant cheap. Industrial meant consistent. Industrial meant national distribution. Industrial meant a company could flood the market and then spend heavily to teach people what the flood was for. Industrial meant the cigarette could be placed into more hands than any hand-rolled trade could ever reach. Industrial meant that when the next great event came, the industry would be ready. And the next great event was war. Not a small marketing campaign, not a local fashion, not a temporary fad, but a global conflict that placed millions of young men into uniforms, moved them far from home, filled their days with boredom and fear, and made portable comfort more valuable than almost anything else. The cigarette had been made cheap by machines and pushed across the country by businessmen. But it still needed a story large enough to make it feel necessary. In the mud, waiting rooms, troop ships, training camps, and trenches of the First World War, it would find that story. By the time cigarettes went to war, they were already cheap, portable, and familiar enough to be found in pockets across the United States. But war gave them something business alone could not give them. It gave them moral permission. It gave them a uniform. It placed them in the hands of frightened young men far from home, and once that happened, the cigarette stopped looking like a questionable urban habit and started looking like comfort under pressure. That is one of the most important turns in this story. Before the First World War, cigarettes still had enemies. Reformers warned against them. Parents worried about boys smoking them. Some states had passed anti-cigarette laws or restrictions. Plenty of respectable Americans still preferred pipes, cigars, or chewing tobacco, and still thought of cigarettes as something a little weak, a little foreign, a little too easy to hide behind a schoolhouse or smoke in an alley. Then millions of soldiers entered military life, and the cigarette entered with them. It did not enter as vice, at least not in the way it had been spoken of before. It entered as relief. Picture a training camp in 1917. The United States has entered the Great War, and young men from farms, towns, cities, immigrant neighbourhoods, factory districts and college campuses are being shaped into soldiers at a speed the country has never attempted before. They are being issued uniforms, drilled, examined, shouted at, vaccinated, counted, transported and trained to live under orders. For many of them, this is the first time they have been far from home. It is the first time they have slept in a barracks with so many strangers. It is the first time their entire day has belonged to an institution. The food is different. The beds are different. The language around them may be different. The future is not just uncertain, it is waiting across an ocean. In that world, a cigarette was not only tobacco, it was a pause that belonged to the soldier himself. Orders could decide where he stood, when he marched, when he ate, when he cleaned his rifle, when he boarded a ship, and when he moved toward danger. But a cigarette held between the fingers, lit in a doorway or under a shelter or beside another man doing the same thing, gave him a small piece of time that felt personal. The cigarette was short enough to fit into military life. It did not ask for a chair, a pipe cleaner, a spittoon, or a long, quiet evening. It could be smoked quickly, shared easily, and crushed under a boot when the whistle blew. This is why war favoured the cigarette over older tobacco habits. A pipe was slower. A cigar was bulkier. Chewing tobacco was messy, and in the conditions of military camps and trenches, mess was already everywhere. A cigarette was compact. It could be packed by the thousands into crates, shipped by the millions, handed out by charities, tucked into a ration, passed from one soldier to another, or hidden in a pocket until the moment came when a man wanted something familiar in his hand. Histories of smoking in the First World War note that tobacco was understood by armies and relief organisations as a source of relief from physical and psychological strain, and cigarettes were especially suited to the conditions of modern war because they were quick and portable. The war itself created long stretches of waiting. That is something easy to forget when we think of battle. We imagine movement, explosions, attacks, noise, and immediate danger. All of that was real, but a soldier's life was also waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for trains, waiting on ships, waiting in camps, waiting in trenches, waiting under shell fire, waiting for letters, waiting for food, waiting for the next march, waiting for a medical inspection, waiting for weather to change, waiting for something terrible to begin or something terrible to stop. A cigarette filled, waiting better than almost anything else. It gave waiting a shape. It put a beginning and an end around a few minutes that otherwise had no edges. Now imagine a group of soldiers just behind the line. Their uniforms are damp. Their boots are never fully dry. Their hands are cracked. The air smells of mud, sweat, cordite, old wool, latrines, horses, oil and smoke. Someone has received a parcel, someone has cigarettes, one is offered. Another soldier leans forward for a light. A match flares briefly, cupped against the wind by two hands. For a second, faces appear out of the dark. Nobody has to say much. The gesture is enough. A cigarette in that moment is warmth, company, distraction, and proof that the ordinary world has not entirely disappeared. That is the part tobacco companies could never have manufactured on their own. They could make cigarettes cheap. They could print advertisements. They could build brands. But the war attached cigarettes to actual need, or at least to something that felt like need. Men who might never have become smokers at home became smokers in uniform because the cigarette was everywhere, and because the situation made it useful. A habit that might have seemed indulgent in a town could feel practical in a trench. A boy who might have been scolded for smoking behind a barn could be handed cigarettes by an organisation supporting the troops. Even some groups that had opposed smoking before the war found themselves drawn into cigarette distribution once the army was overseas. The YMCA, which had been critical of cigarette smoking before the war, eventually allowed and participated in distribution through wartime canteens, while organisations such as the Salvation Army and Red Cross also helped put cigarettes into soldiers' hands. That reversal mattered. When moral organisations, churches, relief workers, families and patriotic committees all began sending cigarettes to soldiers, the public meaning of the cigarette changed. It was no longer only a product sold by tobacco companies, it was a gift from home. The home front learned to think this way very quickly. Newspapers, clubs, churches, fraternal groups, women's organisations and local committees organised drives to send cigarettes overseas. People who might have frowned on a young man smoking in peacetime could still contribute cigarettes to soldiers in France. That is not hypocrisy, so much as wartime logic. War changes the moral weight of objects. Things that were questionable become necessary if they appear to comfort the men at the front. A cigarette in a teenager's mouth might still be condemned. A cigarette in a soldier's hand became almost tender. There were posters and appeals asking civilians to contribute smokes for the boys overseas. Newspapers printed reminders that soldiers wanted tobacco. Tobacco companies understood the opportunity, but so did ordinary people. A carton of cigarettes could be imagined as a small act of service. Most Americans could not go to France. Most could not change the war's outcome directly, but they could buy cigarettes and send them to someone who might smoke one in a cold dugout and feel, briefly, remembered. This is how a product becomes patriotic, not only by waving flags in advertisements, but by becoming part of the emotional traffic between home and battlefield. A mother, sister, sweetheart, church group or factory club sends cigarettes. The soldier receives them. He shares them. He writes home, perhaps mentioning how welcome they were. The next shipment grows larger. The cigarette becomes a token of care that also happens to create and reinforce addiction. That uncomfortable combination is one of the central facts of tobacco's wartime rise. For the soldiers, the cigarette also helped manage fear in a socially acceptable way. A man could not always admit fear directly. Military culture, especially in the early 20th century, gave young men narrow ways to show emotion. But lighting a cigarette before going forward, after coming back, or while waiting for shelling to stop gave the body something to do. Hands that might shake could be occupied. Breathing could be controlled through a repeated action. A man could look calm because he was smoking. He could borrow the appearance of steadiness from the ritual. This did not mean the cigarette removed fear. It did not. But rituals matter when fear has nowhere else to go. Soldiers have always developed small rituals around danger, checking equipment, touching a lucky object, writing a letter, joking, praying, cleaning a weapon, sharing food, lighting a smoke. The cigarette fit perfectly into that pattern because it was small and repeatable. It could be done alone or with others. It did not require an explanation. A soldier did not have to say, "I am afraid." He could say, "Got a light?" There is another thing cigarettes did in military life. They flattened social differences, not completely, of course. Rank still mattered. Class still mattered. Race mattered deeply in the segregated American military, but cigarettes moved across many boundaries more easily than formal conversation did. Officers smoked. Enlisted men smoked. Farm boys smoked. City boys smoked. Immigrants smoked. Mechanics, clerks, students, miners, drivers, and cooks smoked. A brand might mark taste or availability, but the act itself was widely shared. In a mass army made from a mass society, cigarettes became one of the simplest common rituals. They also became a form of currency. Soldiers used cigarettes to trade, thank, persuade, and smooth small transactions. A cigarette could be given to a comrade, a prisoner, a local civilian, a driver, a guard, a tired man who had run out. In later wars, this barter function would become even more visible, but it was already present in the First World War. A cigarette's usefulness came partly from its size. It was small enough to spare, valuable enough to matter, and familiar enough to be accepted. When the war ended in 1918, the soldiers did not leave the cigarette in Europe. They brought the habit home. They also brought home the image of the cigarette as part of soldiering. This was powerful. Veterans returned not as boys sneaking forbidden smokes, but as men who had served. If many of them smoked, smoking gained reflected honour. The cigarette had been tested in the public imagination, under the hardest conditions modern life could produce. It had sat in muddy pockets, crossed the Atlantic, passed through military camps and survived the front. That made it harder to dismiss as a weak or frivolous habit. The post-war effect was enormous because returning soldiers are not just individuals. They are sons, brothers, husbands, co-workers, neighbours, employees, customers, students, and heroes in local memory. They return to farms, factories, schools, shops, offices, garages, police departments, and railroad yards. They bring stories, uniforms, wounds, souvenirs, habits, and gestures. One of those gestures was the practiced reach for a cigarette. A younger brother sees it. A friend sees it. A wife smells it on a coat. A child sees the pack on a dresser. The war has ended, but the cigarette remains in the household. This is one of the reasons the First World War mattered so much to cigarette history. It did not invent smoking among American men, but it accelerated the cigarette's acceptance. It took a product that had been suspect in some circles and associated it with service, masculinity, endurance, and modern war. It placed cigarettes in the hands of young men at exactly the age when lifelong habits often form. And it did so at a scale large enough to change social expectations. The tobacco companies knew what had happened. They did not need to guess. They could see sales rising. They could see that soldiers had become ideal ambassadors. They could continue using military imagery, patriotic language, and masculine themes in advertising. They could suggest, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, that the cigarette was part of the man who had endured. The soldier had helped normalize the cigarette, and the industry would spend the next decades turning that normalization into profit. Then came the Second World War, and the relationship between cigarettes and military life deepened again. By the 1940s, cigarettes were no longer fighting for respectability in the same way. They were already woven into American life. But World War II made them nearly unavoidable in the experience of millions of service members. US military rations during the war commonly included cigarettes along with food, gum, candy, matches, and other small items. A US Defense Department history of C rations notes that besides the main canned foods, soldiers received additions such as chocolate or candy, gum, biscuits, and cigarettes. That is a remarkable detail when you think about it plainly. The government fed soldiers beans, meat, biscuits, sugar, coffee, candy, and cigarettes. Tobacco had moved from private habit to logistical item. It was something quartermasters had to consider, something manufacturers supplied, something troops expected. Cigarettes were packed into the material structure of war. They were not incidental extras bought only at canteens. They were part of what many soldiers encountered as ordinary military provision. Imagine opening a ration during the Second World War. The can is heavy. The food may be cold. You are hungry enough to eat it anyway. There may be crackers, a sweet powdered drink, gum, matches, toilet paper, maybe a tiny pack of cigarettes depending on the ration and period. It is not luxury. It is not comfort in any grand sense, but in a place where comfort is scarce, small things become large. A few cigarettes after a bad meal can feel like the civilized world briefly returning. In the Pacific, in North Africa, in Italy, in France, on ships, in camps, in bombed towns, in muddy fields, in jungle heat, cigarettes followed American troops. They were smoked in foxholes, on transport decks, beside tanks, outside field hospitals, in barracks, at air bases, on leave, during card games, after patrols, and while waiting for mail. War photographs from the period are full of them. A soldier with a helmet pushed back, a nurse on break, a pilot beside an aircraft, men sitting on ammunition boxes, men leaning against ruined walls. Smoke appears again and again because cigarettes were one of the few private habits that war could not easily take away. The tobacco companies again tied themselves to the war effort. They shipped huge numbers of cigarettes to troops, used patriotic advertising, and presented themselves as partners in national morale. Brands competed for loyalty in uniform because a soldier who smoked one brand overseas might remain loyal when he came home. The war created captive customers, but not in the crude sense of force. It created situations where cigarettes were available, useful, socially encouraged, and emotionally charged. A soldier did not have to be coerced into smoking when everyone around him was smoking, when cigarettes came in rations, when officers smoked, when movie stars smoked, when advertisements praised cigarettes as companions of courage, and when the next few minutes were uncertain. There is a dangerous tenderness in this. Cigarettes genuinely did comfort people in the short term. That is part of why the story is complicated. It is not enough to say tobacco companies lied, and everyone was fooled. The immediate relief smokers described was real to them. Nicotine affected the body. The ritual calmed the hands. The social act eased loneliness. A cigarette after fear, exhaustion, hunger, or boredom could feel like help. The long-term cost was hidden by time. The comfort was immediate. Human beings are built to notice the immediate. War intensified that imbalance. A soldier under stress does not live in the same future-oriented way as a person planning a retirement account. He lives hour to hour, sometimes minute to minute. Warnings about future health, even when they existed, had little force against the visible dangers of shells, bullets, disease, shipwreck, accident, and fear. If a cigarette steadied the nerves now, that mattered more than a disease decades away. The industry benefited from this, but the emotional logic belonged to the soldiers themselves. When World War II ended, the returning veterans again carried cigarettes home. But this time the scale was even greater, and the cigarette was entering a country ready for mass consumption on a level earlier Americans had never seen. The post-war United States had rising incomes, suburban homes, automobiles, television, supermarkets, national magazines, and an enormous advertising industry. Millions of veterans returned to civilian life with smoking already embedded in their daily routines. They entered offices, factories, colleges, unions, police forces, construction crews, sales jobs, and family life. A cigarette break became normal. A pack in the shirt pocket became normal. Ashtrays in new houses became normal. Smoking in the car became normal. The military habit blended smoothly into the consumer habit, and the public image of smoking gained another layer. It was not merely modern now. It was not merely masculine or convenient. It had been carried by the generation that defeated fascism. That gave the cigarette a powerful cultural shield. To criticize smoking too harshly in the immediate post-war world could feel, to some people, like criticizing the habits of men who had survived Normandy, Iwo Jima, the Bulge, the skies over Europe, the seas of the Pacific, and years away from home. Of course, not everyone thought this consciously. Most people did not frame it in speeches, but images matter. The smoking veteran was a familiar and respected figure. His cigarette was part of the silhouette. At home, children watched. That may be the most important thing. Children do not need formal instruction in what adulthood looks like. They collect evidence. They see what adults do when they are tired. They see what adults do after meals. They see what adults do when friends visit. They see what fathers do in garages, what mothers do at kitchen tables, what uncles do at barbecues, what movie heroes do on screens, what soldiers do in photographs. In the 1940s and 1950s, much of that evidence pointed towards cigarettes. The wartime normalisation also reached women, though in a different pattern. Women had already become an important market by the 1920s and 1930s through advertising that connected cigarettes to slimness, glamour, and independence. During World War II, women worked in factories, served in military and medical roles, volunteered, waited, worried, and carried their own burdens of stress and change. Cigarettes were part of that world too. A woman smoking no longer shocked in quite the same way it might have in 1900. The war helped accelerate many public changes in women's behaviour and visibility, and cigarettes moved through those changes with ease. Still, military smoking remained especially powerful among men because it linked cigarettes to toughness under hardship. This helped solve the cigarette's old reputation problem completely. Remember where we began. Cigarettes had once been treated by some critics as weak, suspicious, and corrupting. War reversed that image. If a cigarette was good enough for a man in a trench, a bomber crewman, a marine on an island, or an infantryman in winter, then it could not easily be dismissed as delicate. The small white tube had been rebranded by history itself. This is why the phrase, "in every pocket," matters. The cigarette did not have to be in literally every pocket to feel that way. It only had to be common enough that absence became noticeable. In wartime, cigarettes seemed to appear wherever men gathered under pressure. In peacetime after the wars, they appeared wherever those men rebuilt their lives. The habit crossed from barracks to break room, from ration kit to lunch pail, from foxhole to front porch. It moved through memory as much as through commerce. There is a photograph you can imagine even if you have never seen the exact one. A young soldier sits on the ground somewhere far from home. His uniform is dusty. His face is older than his age. His hands hold a cigarette. He's not smiling for an advertisement. He's not trying to look glamorous. He's simply smoking because the cigarette is there and because the moment allows it. That image did more for cigarettes than any slogan could. It made smoking look like endurance, and once cigarettes became associated with endurance, advertisers could build everything else on top of it. Glamour would come, doctors would come, movie stars would come, filter tips, menthol, slim brands, rugged cowboys, office ashtrays, television jingles and magazine spreads would all come later. But the wars gave cigarettes their passport into ordinary American respectability. They made smoking look less like indulgence, and more like something people did when life was hard. That is the uncomfortable heart of this part of the story. Cigarettes conquered America partly because they attached themselves to suffering. Not to leisure first, not to luxury first, but to stress, fear, loneliness, and waiting. They became useful in the places where people had the least control. Once that usefulness was established, it followed people into places where the danger was no longer immediate, but the habit remained. The soldier came home. The pack came with him. The country thanked him. The industry sold to him. His children watched him. His co-workers joined him. The smoke spread through the rooms of civilian life until it no longer seemed to have come from war at all. But it had. Not entirely, not only, but in a way that cannot be separated from the larger rise of cigarette America. The machine made cigarettes cheap. War made them acceptable. War made them emotional. War made them patriotic. War made them a gift, a ration, a comfort, a currency, a symbol of nerves held steady when the world was coming apart. And when peace returned, the cigarette did not go back into the trenches, the camps, the ships, or the ration boxes. It stayed in the American hand, ready for the next transformation, when the people on movie screens and magazine covers would teach the country not just to smoke, but to make smoking look beautiful. When cigarettes came back from war, They did not come back alone. They came back with uniforms, stories, veterans, photographs, and a new kind of respectability. But respectability was only one step. It made the cigarette acceptable. It did not yet make the cigarette beautiful. For that, America needed another machine. Not one made of gears and paper rollers this time, but one made of cameras, studios, magazines, nightclubs, department stores, publicity men, fashion columns, radio voices and faces large enough on a screen that a single hand gesture could travel across the country. The cigarette did not become glamorous because tobacco itself was glamorous. Tobacco was still a plant. It still came from fields and warehouses and curing barns. It still stained fingers and left ash behind. The glamour came from placement. It came from who held it, when they held it, how they held it, and what the audience had been taught to see in that gesture. A cigarette in the hand of a tired soldier could mean endurance. A cigarette in the hand of a jazz musician could mean late-night confidence. A cigarette in the hand of a movie actress could mean elegance, danger, desire, independence, boredom, or control. It was the same object, but the meaning changed with the lighting. That is one of the strange powers of the early 20th century. It taught Americans how to watch one another at scale. Before film, fashion and manners travelled more slowly. A person might copy a local figure, a family member, a church leader, a politician, a wealthy neighbour, someone seen in a city or in a newspaper illustration. But movies changed imitation. A young woman in Kansas could watch a woman on screen in New York-style clothing, raising a cigarette with a certain pause before speaking. A young man in Ohio could watch a gangster, detective, singer, pilot, or romantic lead exhale smoke as if smoke itself were punctuation. The movement could be copied that night outside a theatre, then again at a party, then again at work, until it no longer felt copied at all. The timing mattered. In the 1920s, the cigarette entered a country already unsettled by modernity. The First World War had ended. Prohibition had begun. Cities were growing. Automobiles made courtship more private. Radio carried voices into homes. Jazz clubs and dance halls frightened older moralists and excited younger crowds. Women had gained the constitutional right to vote in 1920, and the public image of the young modern woman, with bobbed hair, shorter skirts, cosmetics, dancing, and a willingness to be seen in public on different terms, became one of the most talked about symbols of the decade. The cigarette entered this social change at exactly the right angle. It could be condemned as evidence of decline or embraced as evidence that the old rules were loosening. Either way, people were talking about it. For women especially, the meaning of smoking shifted dramatically during these years. For much of the earlier period, respectable women smoking in public had been treated as disreputable or shocking, even though private behaviour was always more complicated than public moral codes admitted. By the 1920s, tobacco companies were increasingly willing to market cigarettes to women, though they often did so carefully at first because female smoking still carried social risk. Stanford's tobacco advertising research notes that the 1920s saw the fashionable and daring woman emerge in cigarette advertising, and by the late 1920s companies became bolder in openly targeting women as a way to expand the market. That word market is important, because behind every glamorous image was arithmetic. Men already smoked cigarettes in large numbers, especially after the wars made the habit more acceptable. But women represented an enormous potential customer base. If a company could persuade women that smoking was not shameful, or better yet that it was stylish, modern, slimming, independent and socially current, then the industry could grow without inventing a new product at all. It only had to change who felt permitted to use the old one. This is where advertising stopped merely describing cigarettes and began rewriting social permission. A woman did not need to be told only that a cigarette tasted good. She needed to be told, directly or indirectly, that smoking would not make her look improper. Then she needed to be told that it might make her look up to date. Then she needed to be told that not smoking might make her seem old-fashioned. This was subtle work at times, and not subtle at all at others. Advertisements began to show women not as decorative figures near male smokers, but as smokers themselves. The hand holding the cigarette became part of the image of modern femininity. One of the most famous examples came from Lucky Strike. In 1928, Lucky Strike introduced its Cream of the Crop campaign using celebrity testimonials from female smokers, and in 1929 it followed with the slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet," tying cigarettes to dieting and weight anxiety at a moment when the slim modern body was becoming a powerful cultural ideal. Stanford's archive describes the campaign as designed to exploit female insecurities about weight and diet. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the clearest examples of how cigarettes became more than cigarettes. They were not being sold only as pleasure. They were being sold as discipline. A cigarette was presented as a substitute for dessert, as a way to control appetite, as a tool for managing the body. This was a remarkable move. Something addictive and harmful was repackaged as self-command. A woman who wanted to be fashionable, slim, modern, and socially accepted could be encouraged to see the cigarette not as a vice, but as a helper. The advertisement did not have to shout. It only had to place the cigarette between desire and insecurity. Around the same time came the famous Torches of Freedom episode in 1929, associated with public relations man Edward Bernays. During the New York Easter Parade, a group of women publicly lit cigarettes as a gesture framed around women's emancipation and equality. The phrase Torch of Freedom became attached to the event and to the larger attempt to connect women's public smoking with independence. A historical article indexed by PubMed captures the broader transition in its title alone, describing the marketing of cigarettes to women as a movement from social taboo to torch of freedom. Now, we have to be careful with this story because it is easy to tell it too neatly. It was not that one publicity stunt suddenly made American women smoke. The change was already underway. Women had smoked in private and in some public settings before. Wartime and post-war social shifts had already loosened some restrictions. Urban nightlife had already created spaces where behaviour could be tested. But the Bernays campaign mattered because it showed how directly cigarettes could be attached to the language of liberation. It revealed the industry's willingness to turn a social movement into a sales opportunity. That pattern would repeat again and again across the 20th century. A real desire for freedom would be translated into a purchase. Jazz-age nightlife gave cigarettes another stage. In clubs, speakeasies, hotel lounges, dance halls and restaurants, cigarettes fit the atmosphere of modern pleasure. Prohibition made alcohol illegal but did not make drinking disappear, and the culture around hidden or semi-hidden drinking places made certain kinds of behaviour feel more daring. A cigarette in that setting did not mean the same thing it meant on a farm porch. It belonged to music, short hair, dark tables, saxophones, late hours, flasks, couples dancing too closely for older taste, and the thrill of being part of the new. It was not necessary to be rich to imitate this style. That was the cigarette's advantage. A fur coat, a nightclub table, or a roadster was expensive. A cigarette was not. This is how glamour spreads downward. Very few people can live like the people in advertisements, but many can buy one small object that seems to connect them to that life. A young clerk may not own the dress in the magazine illustration, but she can hold the same cigarette. A young man may not be a movie actor or nightclub band leader, but he can stand in an alley with one shoulder against a wall and smoke as if he has seen enough of the world. That is not foolish. It is human. People use objects to try on identities. The cigarette industry understood that and sold identities by the pack. Hollywood made this process national. In the silent film era, and then especially after the arrival of talking pictures, smoking became part of screen language. A cigarette could tell the audience who someone was before a line of dialogue finished the job. The innocent might not smoke. The dangerous woman might. The tired detective almost certainly would. The nightclub singer might hold a cigarette while listening to bad news. The gangster might smoke as a sign of nerve, the intellectual might smoke while thinking, the rich man might smoke without looking at the match. The romantic hero might light 2 cigarettes at once, one for himself and one for the woman across from him, a gesture that turned nicotine into intimacy. Smoking worked visually because it gave actors something to do. Film loves gestures. A hand moving toward a case, a match struck against a surface, a pause before inhaling, a line delivered through smoke, a cigarette crushed out in anger, left burning in an ashtray during a tense conversation, offered across a table, accepted after hesitation. These movements helped shape scenes. They made stillness look active. They gave emotion a prop. Nervousness, confidence, seduction, contempt, fatigue, boredom and grief could all be played through the same small object. The tobacco industry did not simply watch this happen from a distance. Researchers at Stanford and the University of California, San Francisco used once secret tobacco industry documents to trace marketing deals between tobacco companies and Hollywood studios back to the early years of the film business. Their work found commercial arrangements in which tobacco companies gained star endorsements, while movie studios benefited from national advertising that promoted stars and upcoming films. That is a crucial point. Hollywood smoking was not only an organic reflection of what Americans were already doing. Some of it was paid, planned, and mutually useful. The studio system controlled stars tightly, and tobacco companies understood that stars could reassure a worried public. If the person on the screen was admired, beautiful, masculine, witty, or elegant, and that person smoked a particular brand in an advertisement, then the brand borrowed the star's qualities. The smoker at home was not merely buying tobacco, he or she was buying proximity. By the late 1930s and through the 1940s, the relationship between Hollywood and tobacco had become extensive. The Smoke-Free Media Archive summarizes that from the late 1930s through the 1940s, 2 out of 3 top adult movie stars advertised cigarettes while also smoking on screen, with major tobacco companies collaborating with major studios including Paramount, Warner Brothers, Fox, MGM, Columbia, RKO, United Artists, and Universal. Now picture the magazine rack in a drugstore or train station during this period. The covers show film stars, society women, athletes, singers, smiling couples, war news, fashion, recipes, household products, cars, soaps, powders, and cigarettes. Inside, advertisements connect cigarettes to beauty, throat comfort, athletic ease, taste, refinement, and the voices of famous singers. Stanford's tobacco advertising collection notes that in the 1920s companies began enlisting hundreds of celebrities, including movie stars, singers, athletes, and socialites, and that famous voices were especially useful in campaigns suggesting cigarettes were compatible with healthful, clear speech. This was not a minor detail. The human voice was becoming commercially powerful through radio and sound film. If a singer, actor, announcer, or comedian was known for a voice people loved, then a cigarette endorsement from that person carried a specific reassurance. The implication was simple, even when not stated too bluntly. If this person depends on the throat for a living and still smokes this brand, then perhaps the danger is exaggerated. It was a comforting thought for smokers and a useful one for companies. Celebrity advertising worked because it collapsed distance. A movie star was unreachable, but the cigarette brand was not. You could not live in the studio bungalow, attend the premiere, wear the gown, sign the contract, or be photographed under hot lights. But you could buy the brand the star appeared to prefer. That made the purchase feel personal. Advertising testimonials are one of the oldest forms of selling, and Yale's Selling Smoke exhibition notes that by the 1930s, tobacco companies paid celebrities, especially film stars, to promote brands, while later advertisements paired celebrities with ordinary people to suggest that consumers could smoke the same cigarette as a favourite star or athlete. The genius of this was that smoking looked both exceptional and ordinary at the same time. It was exceptional because glamorous people did it on screen and in magazines. It was ordinary because the product was cheap and available at the corner store. That combination is powerful. Luxury that is actually affordable can spread quickly. A diamond necklace cannot become a daily habit for millions of people. A cigarette can. There is a specific kind of imitation that happens in youth, and the cigarette was perfectly made for it. Adolescents and young adults often learn adulthood by copying visible gestures before they understand the full world those gestures belong to. How to lean, how to answer, how to dress, how to hold silence, how to seem bored when nervous, how to seem confident when unsure. The cigarette gave all of that a physical form. It could be practiced. It could be held awkwardly at first, then more naturally. It offered an immediate costume for adulthood. Hollywood taught the technique. The cigarette between two fingers, not clutched but held lightly. The exhale before answering. The ash tapped without looking. The match cupped in the wind. The lighter snapped closed. The pack offered across the table. These were not merely ways of consuming nicotine. They were ways of performing self-possession. If you were young and uncertain, that performance could be deeply attractive. The cigarette promised not only sensation, but posture. This is why glamour matters so much in a history of addiction. Nicotine created dependence in the body, but glamour created invitation in the imagination. Before a person became chemically dependent, they often had to want the first cigarette or at least accept it. Glamour made that first step easier. It softened the ugliness. It turned coughing into initiation. It made dizziness feel like proof that one was entering the adult world. It gave social discomfort a script, and the script was everywhere. In movies, men smoked during business deals, in police stations, on trains, at bars, in bedrooms, in offices, and beside women they desired. Women smoked in evening gowns, in dressing rooms, in cars, at parties, and in moments of emotional conflict. The cigarette could signal that a woman was not naive, that she had experience, that she knew something the shelter did not. It could also be used to punish or question her respectability, depending on the story. Either way, the cigarette remained meaningful. It drew attention. In real life, that meaning moved into social spaces. A woman lighting a cigarette in a restaurant in 1905 might have been stared at harshly. By the 1930s, in many urban settings, it could be fashionable. Not everywhere, not for every class or community, and not without criticism, but the shift was real. Advertising helped make the sight more common. Movies helped make it appealing. Nightlife helped make it believable. The tobacco industry did not have to change every mind at once. It only had to create enough visible smokers that the old shock weakened. For men, Hollywood refined the cigarette's image too. The old cigarette had sometimes been accused of being weak compared with cigars or pipes. The war helped answer that. Hollywood finished the answer by placing cigarettes in the hands of men who looked strong, controlled, witty, wounded, or dangerous. The gangster film gave cigarettes menace. Film noir gave them fatigue and intelligence. The romantic drama gave them intimacy. The western would later give them ruggedness through certain figures and campaigns. But even before the cowboy became one of the most famous advertising symbols in the country, Hollywood had already taught Americans that a cigarette could belong to a man who commanded the room. The jazz world added another kind of cool. Musicians smoked because many adults smoked, because clubs allowed it, because late nights encouraged it, because breaks between sets invited it, and because the physical world of performance was filled with smoke from audiences as much as performers. Later memory has wrapped jazz smoke in romance, but the real rooms were often crowded, poorly ventilated, loud and exhausting. Smoke clung to clothing, instruments, curtains and ceilings, yet the image became powerful. The musician under low light, the cigarette near the piano, the singer resting between numbers, the crowd in a haze. For many Americans, this suggested sophistication. It suggested being awake when respectable people were asleep. The cigarette was also useful because it made rebellion manageable. Most people do not want to overturn society every morning. They want small permissions. A cigarette allowed a person to feel a little daring without doing anything too difficult. For a young woman in the 1920s, smoking in public could carry a charge of defiance. For a young man, it could signal toughness or worldliness. For both, it could be a way to step slightly outside parental control. The industry sold that feeling carefully. Too much rebellion might frighten buyers. Just enough rebellion could make the product irresistible. At the same time, cigarettes became part of courtship. Asking for a light gave strangers a reason to speak. Offering a cigarette allowed a man or woman to initiate contact without making the approach too direct. Lighting someone else's cigarette brought faces close for a moment. In films, this gesture became charged with meaning. In real life, it gave social interaction a prop and a pause. A cigarette could make flirtation less abrupt because the object carried part of the work. It also helped to normalise touch in public. The match held near another person's face, the hand-shielding flame, the shared lighter, the brief leaning inward, all of it created small moments of intimacy that could be denied as mere practicality. This mattered in a society still full of rules about respectability, gender, and public behaviour. The cigarette offered a loophole. It allowed closeness under the cover of courtesy. But beneath the glamour, the habit was becoming more fixed. The more cigarettes appeared in pleasurable settings, the more they attached themselves to pleasure itself. Drinking, dancing, dating, listening to music, seeing movies, finishing a meal, talking late into the night, driving with friends, waiting outside a theatre, sitting in a diner after midnight, all of these could become linked to smoking. Once linked, the cigarette did not need glamour every time. The body remembered the pairing: coffee and cigarette, drink and cigarette, conversation and cigarette, break and cigarette, nervousness and cigarette, celebration and cigarette, sadness and cigarette. The glamorous first invitation became ordinary repetition. That is the making of a habit in the deepest sense. It is not just that nicotine calls the smoker back, though it does. It is that the day itself becomes full of cues. The end of dinner asks for a cigarette. The start of a drive asks for a cigarette. A telephone call asks for a cigarette. A difficult thought asks for a cigarette. A social gathering asks for a cigarette because everyone else is lighting one. By the time health warnings became impossible to ignore, cigarettes were not sitting outside people's lives as separate decisions. They were woven into gestures, rooms, memories, friendships, and identities. The entertainment and advertising industries helped weave them there. The cigarette moved from the battlefield into the movie palace, from the ration kit into the evening bag, from the soldier's pocket into the actress's fingers, from the factory-made pack into the national imagination. It became not only something people used, but something people recognised. That recognition is what made it so powerful. Even a non-smoker knew what a cigarette meant in a scene. Even a child could read the signal before understanding the product. By the time the 1930s and 1940s arrived, the cigarette had become one of the most flexible symbols in American culture. It could be glamorous or ordinary, masculine or feminine, rebellious or respectable, nervous or calm, social or solitary. That flexibility helped it move everywhere. A product with only one meaning can be confined to one group. A product with many meanings can follow people across age, class, gender, mood and setting. The cigarette's danger was partly that it could become whatever the moment required. So when we look back at Hollywood's smoke and jazz age glamour, we should not see only stylish photographs and old movie scenes. We should see a national training ground. Americans were being taught how smoking looked, when it belonged, who could do it, and what it might say about them. Advertisers supplied the slogans, studios supplied the faces, nightlife supplied the atmosphere, celebrity culture supplied permission. The cigarette, already cheap from machinery and respectable from war, now became desirable in a more personal way. It moved from the pocket to the pose. And once a habit has machinery behind it, war memory beneath it, and glamour wrapped around it, the next question becomes almost unavoidable. If so many admired people smoked, if singers and actors and athletes endorsed brands, if advertisements could fill magazines with calm faces and confident claims, then what about health? What about the cough, the irritated throat, the shortness of breath some smokers noticed and then explained away? The industry understood that glamour could invite people in, but reassurance would keep many of them there. And for that, it found another figure Americans were trained to trust, a figure in a white coat, standing calmly in an advertisement, ready to tell the public that the smoke in the room was nothing to worry about. By the time the cigarette had passed through war and stepped into the glow of Hollywood, it had learned how to look brave, stylish, adult, modern, and necessary. But there was still one question waiting in the room, a question many smokers did not want to ask too loudly, and many companies did not want answered too clearly. What was all that smoke doing to the body? The question was not new. People had noticed for a long time that smoking could irritate the throat, worsen coughing, leave a stale taste in the mouth, and make breathing feel different. You did not need a laboratory to know that inhaling smoke was not the same thing as breathing clean air. Smokers knew this in small ways. They woke with coughs, they cleared their throats, they switched brands when one felt harsh. They talked about mildness, they talked about smoothness, they talked about the cigarette that did not bite, did not scratch, did not irritate, did not leave the throat raw. And the tobacco industry listened closely, not because it wanted people to stop smoking, but because it understood something important about fear. Fear does not always make people quit. Sometimes fear makes people look for reassurance. That reassurance became one of the most strange and revealing parts of cigarette history. Tobacco companies did not only sell pleasure or glamour, they sold comfort against suspicion. They sold the idea that if you chose the right brand, the right filter, the right mild smoke, the right doctor-approved cigarette, then perhaps the worry could be set aside. That is the emotional centre of this period. Millions of Americans were not simply told cigarettes were fashionable. They were told, in one way or another, that cigarettes could be made safe enough to keep using. Now imagine an American living room in the 1940s. There is a radio in the room, maybe a large wooden set with a warm dial. There is a sofa, a floor lamp, a newspaper folded near a chair, and an ashtray heavy enough not to slide when someone taps ash into it without looking. A man comes home from work and lights a cigarette. His wife lights one after dinner. A guest arrives and is offered a cigarette before coffee. In a magazine on the table there is an advertisement showing a confident face, a clean white coat, perhaps a doctor, perhaps someone made to carry the authority of medicine. The ad is calm, it is not panicked, it does not look like a warning, it looks like certainty. That was the point. From the 1930s into the early 1950s, cigarette companies used physicians and medical imagery in advertising with remarkable boldness. A major scholarly review of physician imagery in cigarette advertisements found that companies used doctors to reassure consumers at the very moment public anxiety about smoking and health was increasing, with these campaigns appearing between 1930 and 1953. Medical journals themselves carried cigarette advertisements during this period, including journals read by doctors, which now feels almost impossible to imagine but was entirely real in that world. This is not a small detail. The doctor was one of the most trusted figures in American life. He wore authority on his body, the white coat, the office, the stethoscope, the steady manner, the framed certificate, the controlled language of diagnosis and advice. When a cigarette advertisement placed a doctor near a brand, it borrowed all of that trust. It did not have to prove that smoking was safe. It only had to make danger feel less urgent. It only had to place worry inside a calmer frame. The most famous version was Camel's campaign claiming that more doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette. Stanford's Tobacco Advertising Archive identifies this as a single R.J. Reynolds campaign that ran from 1940 to 1949, often combined with Camel's T-zone language, meaning taste and throat. Think about how carefully that worked. The company was not just saying doctors liked the taste. It was placing the throat, the very place many smokers felt irritation inside the advertisement's reassurance. Taste and throat. Pleasure and comfort. Enjoyment, and the suggestion that the cigarette had been chosen by people who knew the body professionally. The ads did not usually say, in plain scientific language, that cigarettes could not harm you. That would have been too direct and too easy to challenge. Instead, they work through implication. A doctor smokes this. A singer protects her throat with that. A dentist approves another. A laboratory has tested something. A survey has found something. A brand is mild. A filter removes something. A cigarette is gentler. The words circle the anxiety without naming the worst fear too clearly. This is one of the most effective forms of persuasion, not answering the question honestly, but making the person feel less alone in avoiding it. Smokers wanted that comfort. That is important to understand. The industry manipulated people, but it manipulated something already present. A person who has built a habit into every part of the day does not want to be told that the habit may be dangerous. The morning cigarette with coffee, the cigarette after lunch, the cigarette in the car, the cigarette before a meeting, the cigarette on a date, the cigarette with a drink, the cigarette before bed, these are not isolated choices anymore. They are attached to the structure of life. When a warning appears, it threatens not only the product, but the whole routine. Reassurance becomes valuable because it protects the routine from doubt. So the advertisements offered a compromise. You did not have to quit. You only had to switch. That became one of the great moves of tobacco marketing. If your throat felt rough, try a milder brand. If you coughed, try one with a filter. If you worried about irritation, choose the cigarette that doctors preferred, or the one that claimed a cleaner smoke, or the one that promised less harshness. The solution to cigarette anxiety was another cigarette. It was brilliant as business and devastating as public health. Filters were especially important in this story because they gave worry a physical object to hold. A filter looked like technology. It looked like progress. It suggested that something harmful could be trapped before it reached the body. Even without understanding chemistry, a smoker could look at a filter tip and feel that a problem had been addressed. The filter became a little piece of visible reassurance between the burning tobacco and the lungs. The trouble was that reassurance and safety were not the same thing. A smoker could feel safer because a cigarette looked modern and filtered, while still inhaling dangerous smoke. But by the 1950s, this distinction was hard for many ordinary people to evaluate. Scientific reports were appearing, but the tobacco companies were louder, richer, and better placed in daily life. A medical journal article might not reach the kitchen table. A cigarette advertisement did. A cancer study might sound technical and frightening. A familiar brand name with a calm doctor's face sounded manageable. The scientific picture was becoming harder to ignore by the early 1950s. Important epidemiological studies began drawing public attention to the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. In December 1952, Reader's Digest published Roy Knorr's Cancer by the Carton, a widely read article that brought the smoking and cancer issue to a mass audience, and helped produce a public scare serious enough that cigarette consumption reportedly declined for a time. This was a major moment because Reader's Digest reached ordinary households. It was not an obscure medical publication. It sat in homes, waiting rooms, offices, and libraries. People who might never read a scientific paper could read a condensed article with a title that made the danger impossible to miss. Picture that moment. A smoker sitting at a kitchen table, magazine open, cigarette burning in the ashtray. The article says what perhaps had been half suspected already. Lung cancer, once relatively uncommon, has been rising. Cigarettes are being investigated. The evidence is troubling. The smoker looks at the cigarette. Maybe he stubs it out. Maybe he finishes it. Maybe he decides to cut down. Maybe he buys a filtered brand the next day. That uncertainty, that little pause between fear and habit, is exactly where the tobacco industry moved. In January 1954, the heads of major American tobacco companies met in New York to organise a response to the growing health scare. Their answer appeared in newspapers as a frank statement to cigarette smokers, a public relations campaign that sought to dispute, delay, and soften the meaning of the emerging science by emphasising doubt and promising more research. The phrase itself is worth noticing, a frank statement. It sounds honest before it says anything. It borrows the tone of confession and responsibility. It tells the reader, before the argument even begins, that the companies are speaking plainly. But the purpose was not simply to inform. It was to keep people smoking while uncertainty could still be made to feel reasonable. The strategy was not necessarily to prove cigarettes harmless beyond all doubt. It was to insist that doubt remained. Doubt can be commercially useful. If the danger is certain, people may act. If the danger is uncertain, they may wait. If they wait, they may keep buying. In a product that depends on daily repetition, every day of postponed certainty has value. This is one of the most important lessons in the history of cigarette America. The industry did not need Americans to believe smoking was healthy. It needed many of them to believe the question was unsettled enough to continue. It needed them to say, they do not really know yet. Or, my grandfather smoked and lived to 90. Or, everything causes cancer. Or, this brand is filtered. Or, my doctor smokes. Those sentences became little shelters where the habit could hide. The doctor advertisements made those shelters stronger. They gave smokers a way to feel rational rather than reckless. If doctors smoked, then the smoker could tell himself the danger must not be that serious. If a brand was recommended or preferred by physicians, then choosing that brand felt like an intelligent compromise. It is difficult now, after decades of public health education, to re-enter that mindset. But in the 1940s and 1950s, the authority of the doctor in advertising was not absurd to many consumers. Doctors themselves smoked in large numbers. Hospitals were not smoke-free spaces. Medical certainty about the full scale of cigarette harm had not yet reached public clarity. The boundary between medical authority and commercial persuasion was far more porous than it should have been. There were also advertisements built around the throat. This was clever because smokers experienced throat irritation directly. A person might not see lung damage, but he could feel a raw throat. He could hear his own cough. He could notice hoarseness. So the industry addressed that immediate discomfort. It talked about mildness, smoothness, less irritation, no unpleasant aftertaste, no throat scratch, no bite. The promise was not that smoking was good for you. The promise was that this cigarette would bother you less. That was enough. A singer, actor, broadcaster, or public speaker in an advertisement carried the same message in another form. If a person who depended on voice could smoke, then perhaps the smoker at home could stop worrying about his own. Stanford's tobacco advertising collection notes that companies used famous voices, including singers and entertainers, as part of campaigns suggesting cigarette use could be compatible with a clear or valuable voice. This kind of advertising worked because it took a real anxiety and answered it with a familiar face rather than a medical explanation. The strange thing is that these ads often sound calmest when the underlying problem is growing most serious. As evidence mounted, the advertisements did not become more cautious in a moral sense. They became more strategic. The tobacco companies knew health concerns were rising. They knew smokers were nervous. They knew brand switching was a danger and an opportunity. So advertisements focused more and more on claims that could hold anxious customers: mildness, filters, laboratory testing, doctor preference, throat comfort. The cigarette was not only sold as pleasure now, it was sold as managed risk. This shaped how Americans talked about smoking. Instead of asking whether to smoke, many asked what to smoke: regular or filtered, strong or mild, menthol or not, brand A or brand B. This was a powerful narrowing of imagination. It kept the consumer inside the marketplace. A person worried about cigarettes could still behave as a cigarette customer. The industry had transformed health fear into brand competition. Inside homes, the effect was complicated. Families argued, some people quit, some cut down, some switched brands, some dismissed the warnings, some read the articles and felt afraid but kept smoking because everyone around them smoked, and the habit had already settled deep into the day. Imagine a mother reading a warning while an ashtray sits beside her sewing basket. Imagine a father coughing in the morning and then reaching for the pack, because coffee without a cigarette no longer feels like coffee. Imagine a teenager watching both the warning and the behaviour, learning that adults often live with contradictions they do not explain. Doctors themselves were caught in this world. Many smoked because they were people of their time. Some were sceptical of early evidence. Others became alarmed. Some advised patients to stop, especially those with heart, lung or digestive problems. But the image of the doctor in advertising created a public impression that medicine and smoking could coexist comfortably. That impression slowed the emotional force of warnings. It told Americans, in effect, that respectable knowledge had not turned against the cigarette yet. The turning point, at least publicly, came later. On January 11th, 1964, US Surgeon General Luther Terry released the first report of the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee on Smoking and Health. The CDC describes the committee as reviewing more than 7,000 articles related to smoking and disease, before concluding that cigarette smoking was causally related to lung cancer in men, and a major cause of chronic bronchitis, among other findings. The National Library of Medicine notes that the report estimated average smokers had a 9 to 10-fold increased risk of developing lung cancer compared with non-smokers, with heavy smokers facing even higher risks. But before that report landed with the force of federal authority, there were years when Americans lived in the uneasy middle. That middle is where this chapter of the story belongs. The evidence was building. The ads were soothing. The cough was real. The doctor in the magazine was smiling. The cigarette was familiar. The filter looked scientific. The brand promised mildness. The smoker wanted to believe there was still a safe way to keep the ritual. It is easy from the present to look back and feel superior. To say, how could they believe this? How could a doctor appear in a cigarette advertisement? How could a magazine print those claims? How could people keep smoking while the warnings grew louder? But that reaction misses something essential about human behaviour. People do not live inside future knowledge. They live inside the information, pressure, habits, authorities, and comforts available to them at the time. And when a habit is tied to stress relief, identity, work, social life, and pleasure, people do not surrender it easily just because danger appears. They negotiate with danger. They bargain. They look for exceptions. The tobacco industry supplied those exceptions in bulk. It gave smokers words to use against their own fear. Mild, smooth, filtered, tested, preferred, recommended, low irritation, better taste, better throat comfort. It gave them images, doctors, nurses, athletes, singers, actors, laboratories, healthy couples, clean white spaces. It gave them choice, and choice felt like control. That was the strange comfort of being told it was safe enough. The result was a country where smoke kept filling the rooms, even as doubt entered those same rooms. A man could read about cancer and still smoke at breakfast. A woman could choose a filtered brand and feel she had made a sensible adjustment. A doctor could tell one patient to quit while lighting his own cigarette in the office. A magazine could publish health concerns in one issue and cigarette advertisements in another. America was not simply ignorant. It was divided against itself, and the cigarette lived in that division. And while the arguments continued, the physical world kept adapting to smoke. Ashtrays became standard equipment in homes, offices, restaurants, hotel rooms, cars, trains and airplanes. Lighters were given as gifts. Cigarette cases became accessories. Desk sets included ashtrays. Coffee tables were designed with them in mind. Public spaces did not merely tolerate smoking, they prepared for it. By the time the medical truth became too strong to ignore, smoking was not only a private habit, it had become part of the built environment, part of how American rooms were arranged, how workers took breaks, how meals ended, how travel felt, and how strangers shared space without ever asking whether the air belonged to everyone. By the time America reached the middle of the 20th century, cigarettes had moved beyond the pocket, beyond the advertisement, beyond the movie screen, and into the architecture of ordinary life. They were no longer just something people did. They were something rooms expected. That is the stage of the story where the cigarette becomes hardest to see clearly, because once a habit is built into the furniture, the air, the schedule, the workplace, the restaurant table, the car dashboard, and the airplane seat, it stops looking like a decision and begins to look like the way the world is arranged. That is what cigarette America felt like at its height. Not a nation where a few people smoked in corners, but a nation where smoke drifted through shared spaces as if it had a right to be there. In 1965, when the National Health Interview Survey first measured adult cigarette smoking, about 42% of American adults were current smokers, including 52% of men and 34% of women. That means smoking was not marginal. It was not a fringe behaviour. It was nearly half the adult country, and in many public settings it could feel like even more than that, because smokers produced something non-smokers could not avoid. Air that belonged to everyone but was used by some as if it belonged only to them. Imagine walking into an office in 1958. Not a dramatic office. Not the office of a movie executive or a senator or a famous newspaper editor. Just an ordinary workplace with desks lined in rows, filing cabinets, ringing telephones, typewriters, carbon paper, coffee cups, wire baskets, calendars on the wall, and ashtrays placed where today you might expect a stapler or a computer mouse. A man in a white shirt is smoking while reading a memo. A secretary has a cigarette balanced on the edge of an ashtray while she types. Someone at the next desk lights another before the first has fully gone out. The windows may not open, the ceiling may be low, the ventilation may be poor. By mid-afternoon the room has its own weather. There is a colour to rooms like that in old memory. Not exactly grey, not exactly blue, but a thin suspended haze that softens the far wall. Smoke rises from the ends of cigarettes, from ashtrays, from people talking, thinking, waiting, arguing, calculating, dictating, and postponing the next task. A cigarette sits in an ashtray and burns even when no one is inhaling it, which means the room keeps smoking after the smoker has stopped for a moment. The air carries the smell into hair, paper, curtains, wool coats, and the cuffs of shirts. A file folder can smell like smoke. A paycheck can smell like smoke. A receptionist's desk can smell like smoke before the day has properly begun. This is the part modern people often underestimate. Smoking was not only allowed in many workplaces, it was accommodated. The physical environment expected it. Desks had ashtrays. Conference rooms had ashtrays. Reception areas had ashtrays. Elevators sometimes had ashtrays built near the doors. Hotel lobbies had them. Bank counters had them. Courtrooms had them in earlier periods. College offices had them. Police stations had them. Newsrooms were legendary for them. If a place expected adults to spend time there, it often expected cigarettes to be present too. And because smoking was so common, the non-smoker had limited social power. A non-smoker could dislike the smell, cough, move a chair, open a window if there was one, or complain quietly. But to demand that everyone stop could sound unreasonable in a culture that treated smoking as a normal adult behaviour. That is one of the central tensions of the smoking century. For the smoker, lighting up felt personal. For everyone else, the smoke was communal. The act belonged to one person. The air belonged to the room. In the office, cigarettes also shaped time. The smoke break became one of the standard rituals of working life. It was informal in some places, recognised in others, resented by some, cherished by many. A person stepped away from the desk, leaned near a stairwell, stood by a loading dock, gathered outside a factory entrance, or stayed right at the desk because leaving was not necessary yet. Cigarettes divided the day into small recoverable pieces. Morning work, cigarette. More work, lunch, cigarette. A difficult phone call, cigarette. A meeting, cigarette. The end of the day, cigarette in the car. For office workers especially, smoking gave the body something to do in work that was increasingly mental, clerical, repetitive, or socially restrained. A factory worker might use the hands all day. A typist used them too, but under a different kind of pressure. A manager sat through conversations he could not easily escape. A salesman waited for calls. A secretary absorbed moods, deadlines, mistakes, and interruptions. A cigarette gave tension a visible outlet. It made nerves look like routine. Now move from the office to the diner, because the diner was one of the great public rooms of cigarette America. Picture a long counter with round stools, chrome edges, a pie case, a coffee urn, laminated menus, sugar dispensers, ketchup bottles, napkin holders and ashtrays sitting between place settings. The ashtray might be thick white glass with a restaurant logo. It might be metal. It might be a cheap brown plastic tray with melted scars along the rim. It belonged there as naturally as the coffee cup. The diner cigarette had its own timing. Before the meal, while waiting. After the meal, with coffee. During conversation, if the other person was eating slowly and you were finished. At 2 a.m, when the room held truck drivers, nurses, students, musicians, police officers, insomniacs, couples talking too seriously, and men who had nowhere else to go. Cigarettes suited diners because diners were places of pause. They were not formal restaurants where manners might restrain the body. They were public but intimate, cheap but social, bright but lonely. A cigarette fit that contradiction perfectly. Think about breakfast in that world. Bacon on a plate, eggs, toast, coffee, and someone lighting a cigarette before the check arrives. Today that combination feels jarring in many places, but for decades it was ordinary. Coffee and cigarettes became one of the strongest pairings in American habit. The bitterness of the coffee, the nicotine hit, the adult stillness of sitting in a booth before the day began or after the night ended. The diner did not simply permit the ritual, it staged it. Restaurants tried to manage smoking long before they eliminated it. Eventually there would be smoking and non-smoking sections, those strange divided territories in a single room where the air itself was expected to obey signs. But smoke does not understand seating charts. It moves. It drifts over partitions, across aisles, above booths, through the invisible boundary between one family trying to eat dinner without smoke and another table where the ashtray is already full. The idea of a smoking section made sense culturally, before it made sense scientifically. It was a compromise built around politeness rather than air movement. The same illusion followed Americans into airplanes. If there is one setting that reveals the absurdity of divided air, it is the airplane cabin. A tube of pressurized space sealed high above the ground, with rows of people breathing recirculated air for hours, and for much of the 20th century, some of them smoking. The airlines did not invent the phrase smoking or non-smoking, but they made it feel almost comic in hindsight. The difference between the sections might be a curtain, a row number, a few seats, or nothing more substantial than the announcement itself. Smoke rose, spread and travelled because smoke does what smoke does. Imagine boarding a domestic flight in the 1970s. The seats are narrower than comfort, but perhaps less crowded than some flights today. Passengers carry paper tickets. The flight attendants move through the aisle in uniforms that look carefully designed to project calm. The overhead bins are smaller. The cabin fills slowly. Someone lights a cigarette after takeoff when the sign permits it. Then another. Then a row farther back. A person in the non-smoking section smells it anyway. A child watches the smoke curl in the light from the oval window. A flight attendant works the aisle for hours in air she did not choose. This is where the story begins to change. For a long time, the central public argument had been about the smoker's health. Did cigarettes hurt the person who chose to smoke? By the 1970s and especially the 1980s, the argument increasingly became about everyone else. What about the spouse, the child, the co-worker, the waitress, the flight attendant? The passenger seated one row away from the imaginary border. Once the health issue moved from the smoker's body to the shared air, Cigarette America began to lose one of its strongest protections, the idea that smoking was a private choice. The evidence mounted. In 1986, the Surgeon General's report on involuntary smoking concluded that involuntary smoking causes disease, including lung cancer, in healthy non-smokers, and that separating smokers and non-smokers within the same airspace could reduce exposure but did not eliminate it. That last point struck directly at the logic of smoking sections, especially in places like offices, restaurants and aircraft cabins, where the air could not be neatly divided by manners or signs. But before that conclusion became common knowledge, millions of people worked and lived inside smoke-filled environments. Think about restaurant workers. A customer smoked for an hour. A waitress worked an 8-hour shift, breathing dozens of customers' cigarettes. A bartender stood behind a counter in a room dense with smoke until closing, then went home with the smell in his hair and clothing. A hotel housekeeper cleaned rooms where ashtrays overflowed beside beds. A secretary sat near a boss who smoked through meetings. A nurse worked in a hospital where smoke still appeared in waiting rooms, lounges, and sometimes shockingly close to patient care. Hospitals are important here because they show how deep the normalization went. The Centre for the Study of Tobacco and Society describes late 1960s photographs showing cigarette displays in a hospital gift shop, a patient smoking, a physician smoking on rounds, and even a hospital volunteer selling snacks and cigarettes to patients. It also documents promotional material from tobacco companies aimed at doctors and hospitals in the earlier period. There are few images that better capture Cigarette America than a patient in a hospital bed with a cigarette. The place devoted to healing still made room for the habit that was helping fill it. That does not mean no one objected. People did. Some doctors warned patients. Some workers complained. Some parents disliked smoke around children. Some local ordinances began restricting smoking in public places. Some businesses adopted rules before laws forced them. But the shift was slow because smoke-filled America had enormous inertia. Too many people smoked. Too many companies profited. Too many rooms were already arranged around ashtrays. Too many smokers felt judged when asked not to light up. Too many non-smokers had been trained to tolerate discomfort as the cost of public life. Cars made the issue more intimate. The cigarette in the car is one of the defining images of mid-century America. One hand on the steering wheel, one hand holding a cigarette out the cracked window, ash flicked into the wind, the lighter glowing from the dashboard. Automobiles came with cigarette lighters and ashtrays built into the design. Not as accessories for unusual users, but as normal features. Front ashtray, rear ashtray, sometimes one in each door. The car assumed smoking passengers the way it assumed a glove compartment. Inside a car, smoke became family air. A parent smoked in the front seat while children sat in the back. Windows might be cracked, especially in winter or rain. The smell sank into the upholstery. Long trips carried a mixture of vinyl, gasoline, warm engine, fast food, and cigarette smoke. For many children, that smell became part of memory before they knew enough to call it second-hand exposure. They did not vote on it. They did not choose it. They simply breathed the atmosphere adulthood created around them. The home was no different. Ashtrays on coffee tables, ashtrays beside beds, ashtrays on porch railings, Ashtrays in bathrooms during parties. Guests arrived and were offered cigarettes the way they were offered a drink. A hostess might place clean ashtrays before company came, not because everyone smoked, but because enough people did that failing to provide them could seem inhospitable. In some homes, a full ashtray was a sign that the evening had gone well. People had stayed, talked, laughed, argued, played cards, listened to records, drank coffee, and smoked until the room turned stale. The smell became part of objects. Curtains yellowed. Lampshades absorbed it. Ceilings changed colour. White walls became cream, then beige, then a shade no paint company intended. Books carried it. Wool coats carried it. A child hugging a grandparent might smell tobacco before soap. A motel room could announce its history the moment the door opened. Cigarette smoke was not only in the air, it was in the material memory of the place. At the same time, cigarette advertising kept presenting smoking as clean, social, fresh, and controlled. That contrast is remarkable. The real ashtray was messy. The real room smelled stale by morning. The real cough interrupted breakfast. The real diner booth had burns on the edge. But the advertised cigarette lived in bright light. Clean hands, healthy faces, snowy ski slopes, beaches, cocktail parties, and polished office scenes where the ash never seemed to spill and the curtains never yellowed. Advertising did not show the room the next day. There is something revealing about ashtrays themselves. They were designed in endless forms: glass, ceramic, metal, plastic, novelty shapes, hotel logos, airline logos, restaurant logos, corporate gifts, souvenir ashtrays from tourist towns, elegant ashtrays for executives, cheap ashtrays for diners, pedestal ashtrays for lobbies, standing ashtrays filled with sand near elevators. They were evidence that smoking had been granted infrastructure. A society does not make that many objects for something it expects to disappear. In offices, ashtrays also marked hierarchy. The executive might have a heavy desk ashtray, perhaps crystal or polished metal. A conference table might have one at every few seats. The employee at a lower desk might use something plain. A visitor might be offered a cigarette in the office of a powerful person and feel that refusing disrupted the rhythm of the meeting. Smoking could be politeness, dominance, nerves, thought, hospitality, or pressure depending on who lit first. The cigarette helped people manage silence in professional settings. A pause in conversation could be filled by lighting up. A difficult question could be delayed by reaching for the pack. A negotiation could slow while ash was tapped. In newsrooms, advertising agencies, law offices, police stations, faculty lounges, and union halls, smoke became part of the thinking atmosphere. People associated cigarettes with concentration because they had trained themselves to concentrate while smoking. The addiction and the work fused. In diners and bars, the fusion was social. A drink asked for a cigarette. A cup of coffee asked for a cigarette. A jukebox song asked for one. A card game asked for one. Waiting for someone late asked for one. Breaking up with someone might require several. The habit learned emotions and locations. That is why quitting could become so difficult even for people who understood the danger. They were not giving up only nicotine. They were giving up the cigarette after a meal, the cigarette during a phone call, the cigarette with the first coffee, the cigarette outside in the cold with a co-worker who knew the same complaints. This is also why smoke-free laws felt to many smokers like more than regulation. They felt like an attack on rhythm, identity, sociability, and personal refuge. When offices began restricting smoking, the smoker had to leave the desk. When restaurants separated sections, the smoker had to identify himself. When airplanes banned smoking, the smoker had to endure the entire flight without the ritual. When hospitals removed cigarettes, the habit lost one of its most surreal protections. The world was not simply becoming cleaner, it was reorganising the smoker's day. The airline fight showed how hard that reorganisation could be. Flight attendants were among the workers most directly affected because they spent their working lives in sealed cabins, where passenger choice became occupational exposure. The Centre for the Study of Tobacco and Society notes that flight attendants, including activist Patty Young, lobbied Congress for nearly 2 decades to end smoking on commercial aircraft. A federal ban on smoking on domestic flights of less than 2 hours went into effect in 1988. Congress extended the ban to domestic flights under 6 hours in 1990 and to all domestic and international flights in 2000. The final federal rule in 2000 implemented the statutory ban for scheduled passenger flights of US air carriers and covered scheduled foreign air carrier segments between the United States and foreign points. Think about what that means emotionally. For decades, people had smoked in the sky. Then, slowly, flight by flight, route by route, law by law, the cabin changed. The ashtrays remained for safety, because rules are never obeyed perfectly, but the smoke was no longer supposed to be there. A person boarding a plane after the ban entered a different sensory world. Not fresh exactly, not perfect, but no longer carrying that old blue haze. The disappearance of smoke from aircraft made visible what had been tolerated for so long. People realised the air could be different. The same realisation happened in restaurants, offices, buses, schools, hospitals and public buildings. At first, the absence of smoke could feel strange. A bar without smoke seemed wrong to some people, almost too bright, too exposed. A restaurant without ashtrays seemed incomplete. An office where no one smoked at the desk felt more formal. But then the new normal formed, as normal always does. Clothes stopped smelling after dinner. Children stopped sitting under smoke clouds in family restaurants. Workers stopped spending entire shifts in tobacco haze. People began to notice old smoke more sharply because they were no longer surrounded by it every day. That is one of the most powerful things about changing a public habit. While the old habit is everywhere, it feels natural. Once it retreats, it can suddenly feel astonishing that anyone accepted it. The same person who once sat calmly in a smoky airplane might later wonder how that was ever allowed. The same restaurant that once placed ashtrays on every table might later ban smoking at the door. The same office worker who once typed through a cloud might later complain if someone smoked near the entrance. Culture can change so thoroughly that memory begins to sound exaggerated. But it was not exaggerated. Cigarette America was real. The office, the diner, the airplane, the hospital, the car, the motel, the living room, the bar, the bowling alley, the beauty salon, the college lounge, the factory gate, the courthouse hallway, the hotel lobby, the taxi, the bus station, the theatre lobby before the film, all of them carried smoke in one way or another. The cigarette had taken over not simply because people smoked, but because the country built room for the smoke. And that is where the story stands before the next turn. The cigarette had become cheap through machinery, respectable through war, glamorous through Hollywood, reassuring through doctors and advertisements, and physically embedded in the places Americans worked, ate, travelled, healed, waited, and lived. By the late 20th century, the question was no longer only whether cigarettes harmed smokers. It was whether an entire society had been organised around protecting a product at the expense of everyone breathing nearby. Once that question became unavoidable, the cigarette companies faced something more dangerous than private doubt. They faced warning labels, lawsuits, internal documents, public anger, and a slow unravelling of the world they had spent nearly a century building. The first warning label did not arrive like a thunderclap. It did not shout from the package. It did not show a diseased lung. It did not accuse the company. It did not tell the smoker to stop. It appeared as a small printed sentence on the side of a pack, modest, legal, almost shy in its first form, the kind of warning that could sit beneath the cellophane and still be ignored by a hand that had opened the same brand every morning for 20 years. That is one of the strangest things about the beginning of the end of Cigarette America. It started not with smoke disappearing, but with a few words being added to the object that had once needed no explanation at all. For nearly half a century, cigarette companies had taught Americans to see the pack as a promise. The pack promised flavour, calm, glamour, masculinity, slimness, throat comfort, modernity, independence and companionship. Then the government forced the pack to carry a different message, one that did not belong to the advertiser, one that interrupted the dream. It was still a cigarette package, still coloured and branded and familiar, but now it carried a small official doubt. That doubt mattered, not because every smoker read it and quit. Most did not. Not because it immediately emptied ashtrays across the country. It did not. It mattered because for the first time, the warning was no longer only in a medical journal, a newspaper article, a worried spouse's voice, or a private cough in the morning. It was attached to every pack. The road to that label ran through January 11th, 1964, when Surgeon General Luther Terry released the first major federal report on smoking and health. The advisory committee had reviewed more than 7,000 scientific articles related to smoking and disease, and it concluded that cigarette smoking was a cause of lung cancer in men, a probable cause in women, and an important cause of chronic bronchitis. It also stated that cigarette smoking was a health hazard serious enough to require action. That report did not create the evidence from nothing. Scientists had been building the case for years, but it gave the evidence federal authority and public weight in a way no single journal article could have done. Imagine that Saturday in 1964, a smoker at a kitchen table, a newspaper open, coffee cooling beside an ashtray. The report is discussed on the radio, in the papers, on television news, in offices, in medical circles, in homes where someone has been coughing for years. The smoker has heard rumours before. Everyone has heard rumours by then. Cancer by the carton. Studies. Doctors arguing. Statistics. But this is different. This is not a reformer scolding from a pamphlet or a worried columnist asking a question. This is the Surgeon General of the United States saying, in the careful language of public health, that the habit millions of people had built into their daily lives was dangerous. That is a hard thing for any society to absorb. It is harder when the product in question is not rare, not exotic, not confined to a small group but present in nearly every room. In 1964, cigarettes were not a fringe vice waiting to be exposed. They were in shirt pockets, purses, desk drawers, vending machines, lunch counters, bowling alleys, hospital gift shops, airplane seats, car ashtrays, motel rooms, living rooms, and military memories. To say cigarettes cause disease was not only to criticise an industry, it was to disturb the habits of parents, doctors, soldiers, teachers, factory workers, actors, clergy, politicians, nurses, salesmen and teenagers trying to look older than they were. The report entered a country that had been trained for decades to see cigarettes as normal, and it asked that country to look again. The first federal response was cautious by later standards. In 1965, Congress passed the Federal Cigarette Labelling and Advertising Act, requiring warning labels on cigarette packages and annual reports to Congress on the health consequences of smoking. The government had now placed public health language directly onto a mass consumer product that had once been wrapped almost entirely in advertising fantasy. The label was not enough, and almost everyone understood that eventually, even if they disagreed about what should happen next. A warning on the side of the pack had to compete with the rest of the package. The brand loyalty, the smoker's craving, the memory of pleasure, and the social habits around smoking. It also had to compete with an industry that had no intention of surrendering quietly. The tobacco companies had spent decades learning how to answer doubt with reassurance. They had used doctors, filters, mildness, low-tar language, celebrity endorsement, and the comforting idea that the right brand could solve the smoker's anxiety. A label could interrupt that story, but it could not erase it overnight. Then came television. For years, cigarette advertising had poured through American broadcasting. Jingles, cartoon figures, handsome men, bright slogans, cheerful animation, cowboys, couples, parties, and brand names repeated until they lodged in memory. The cigarette had become one of the great products of the television age, even as television itself began carrying anti-smoking messages under the pressure of public health arguments and broadcast fairness rules. In 1970, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act required stronger warning language on cigarette packages and banned cigarette advertising on American radio and television. That ban changed the sound of American advertising. Think of it this way. For a generation, cigarettes had been able to enter the family living room not as smoke, but as song. A child did not have to smoke to know the slogans. A person did not have to buy the brand to recognise the tune. Television gave cigarette companies a way to make tobacco feel cheerful, social, and harmless at the exact moment families were gathered together after dinner, often while actual cigarettes burned in actual ashtrays. When the ads left the airwaves, a major door closed. But doors close unevenly. The cigarette industry did not lose all its power because it lost television. It moved money elsewhere. Magazines, billboards, store displays, sponsorships, coupons, branded merchandise, sports, music, point-of-sale advertising and carefully designed packages became even more important. The cigarette companies had always been adaptable. They were not one-trick advertisers. They had survived moral campaigns, medical scares, and shifting public taste before. After television, they adjusted again. This is why the end of Cigarette America was slow. It was not one law, one report, one label, or one lawsuit. It was pressure applied over decades from many directions. Scientific certainty grew stronger. Public health campaigns became more direct. Smoking restrictions expanded. Taxes rose. Lawsuits exposed internal documents. Parents became more cautious. Non-smokers became less willing to breathe other people's smoke. Doctors changed their advice. Hospitals changed their rules. Airlines changed their cabins. Restaurants changed their signs. Offices changed their break rooms. The culture moved by inches, then by feet, then by miles. Still, the industry fought. It fought science by emphasizing doubt. It fought regulation by invoking choice and commerce. It fought lawsuits by arguing responsibility, causation, warnings, and personal decision. For years, individual smokers and families struggled to win cases because tobacco companies had money, lawyers, expert witnesses, and a powerful argument. People knew smoking was risky and chose to smoke anyway. That argument could be persuasive to juries, especially in a culture that valued personal responsibility. The companies could point to warning labels and say the smoker had been told. They could point to habit and say the smoker had chosen. What the lawsuits eventually began to reveal, however, was that the story was not as simple as choice. The deeper legal attack came when plaintiffs and state attorneys general began focusing not only on whether smoking was dangerous, but on what the companies knew, when they knew it, and what they did with that knowledge. That changed the moral shape of the courtroom. The question became less about a single smoker's behaviour, and more about corporate conduct over time. Did companies understand addiction? Did they manipulate nicotine? Did they market to young people while denying that they did? Did they publicly dispute health risks while internal research told a more troubling story? Did they create confusion as a business strategy? The state lawsuits of the 1990s became a turning point because states argued that they were paying enormous Medicaid costs for smoking-related illness. Mississippi was one of the first to move, and other states followed. The tobacco companies now faced not only individual plaintiffs, but governments with resources, political visibility, and the ability to demand internal documents. In 1998, the Master Settlement Agreement was reached between major cigarette manufacturers and 46 states, with additional territories and jurisdictions involved through related agreements. The agreement required enormous payments to the states and imposed major advertising restrictions, including limits on youth targeting, bans on cartoons in advertising, and the elimination of billboard and public transit cigarette advertising. It also helped make millions of internal tobacco industry documents available to the public. That document release mattered almost as much as the money, maybe more in a historical sense. Money can be spent, diverted, argued over, wasted, or folded into budgets. Documents stay. Internal memos, research notes, strategy discussions, marketing plans, and corporate communications gave historians, journalists, lawyers, scientists, and the public a way to see behind the polished advertisements. The cigarette companies had once spoken to America in slogans. Now America could read some of what they had said to themselves. That was a different kind of warning label, not printed on the pack, but attached to the industry's reputation. The old ads had shown doctors, actors, cowboys, athletes, couples, and clean white filters. The documents showed calculation. They showed a business not merely selling a product people happen to like, but studying dependence, youth markets, public fear, and regulatory pressure. The cigarette, which had once been wrapped in glamour, began to look more and more like evidence. The Joe Camel controversy captured this shift in public feeling. Introduced in the late 1980s, the cartoon camel became one of the most recognizable tobacco advertising figures in America. To the company, he was branding. To critics, he was a symbol of youth marketing, proof that cigarette advertising still found ways to reach children even after decades of denial. By the time the Master Settlement Agreement eliminated cartoons from cigarette advertising, the cultural mood had changed sharply. The cigarette companies could still defend themselves, but they no longer controlled the story as completely as they once had. The federal government's racketeering case against major tobacco companies pushed the public record even further. In 2006, U.S. District Judge Gladys Kessler issued a landmark decision in United States versus Philip Morris, finding that major tobacco companies had violated civil racketeering law by engaging in a long-running conspiracy to deceive the public about the health risks of smoking, nicotine addiction, manipulation of nicotine delivery, second-hand smoke, and the marketing of cigarettes. The Department of Justice's Civil Division describes the case as one of the major legal actions against tobacco companies, and public health law summaries emphasize that the court found decades of fraud and deception. By then, Cigarette America was already shrinking, but the ruling helped name what had happened. Naming matters. For decades, public health advocates had argued that the industry misled people. Smokers had suspected, denied, joked, argued, and sometimes blamed themselves. Families had buried relatives and wondered when the truth had become unavoidable. The court record supplied a formal answer. The deception had been organised, sustained, and profitable. Yet the end remained slow because addiction is slow to release people, and culture is slow to rearrange itself. Warning labels did not reach backward and unmake the morning cigarette. Lawsuits did not remove the craving from the body. Smoking bans did not erase memory. A person who had smoked since age 16 did not become a non-smoker simply because a courtroom produced documents or a restaurant removed ashtrays. Quitting could mean headaches, irritability, grief, weight gain, anxiety, failed attempts, shame, and the strange emptiness of not knowing what to do with the hands after meals. For millions, the cigarette had been a companion longer than many friendships, marriages, or jobs. That does not make it kind. It makes it powerful. At the same time, the world around smokers kept changing. The pack cost more. The places to smoke grew fewer. The smell became less socially tolerated. Children came home from school with anti-smoking lessons. Doctors asked more directly. Employers restricted smoking. Airplanes banned it. Hospitals banned it. Restaurants and bars, once among the last strongholds of indoor smoking, began to change under state and local laws. The smoker moved from the desk to the hallway, from the hallway to the doorway, from the doorway to the parking lot, from the parking lot to a marked area near the edge of the property. This was not only a legal change, it was a social demotion. The cigarette, once welcomed with ashtrays in every room, was being moved outside. That movement outside may be one of the clearest signs that Cigarette America had ended. Not because cigarettes disappeared, but because they lost control of the shared room. In the old world, the non-smoker adjusted. In the new world, the smoker adjusted. That reversal took decades, and it changed daily life in ways that now feel ordinary. A person can eat dinner in most American restaurants without smoke drifting over from the next table. A child can fly without watching passengers light cigarettes after takeoff. A hospital smells like disinfectant and coffee, not ash. An office may have stress, gossip, bad lighting, and stale air, but not the steady burn of cigarettes at every desk. These changes are so familiar now that it is easy to forget they were fought. Federal regulation continued as well. In 2009, the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act gave the Food and Drug Administration authority to regulate tobacco products and placed restrictions on tobacco marketing and sales to youth. The fact that FDA authority came so late is itself remarkable. Cigarettes have been one of the deadliest mass consumer products in American history, yet comprehensive federal regulatory power over tobacco arrived only after the cigarette's cultural dominance had already been badly weakened. The law did not mark the beginning of tobacco control. It marked a later stage in a long struggle that had already passed through science, labels, broadcast bans, public smoking restrictions, state lawsuits, and exposed documents. The numbers show the scale of the decline. In 1965, about 42% of American adults smoked cigarettes. By 2024, National Health Interview Survey data showed adult cigarette smoking at 9.9%, below 10% for the first time in that data series. That is a massive cultural reversal, but numbers alone can make it sound cleaner than it was. A falling percentage does not show the arguments at kitchen tables, the ashtrays removed from hotel rooms, the old smoker standing outside in winter, the young person choosing a vape instead of a cigarette, the tobacco towns watching an industry lose prestige, the families calculating hospital bills, or the person who quits after the fifth attempt and never quite stops wanting one after coffee. And cigarettes did not simply vanish. They remain part of American life, especially among groups and regions where stress, poverty, rural isolation, mental health burdens, military history, and targeted marketing have kept smoking more common. The decline has not been evenly distributed. Cigarette America did not end in the same way for everyone. For some, it ended when restaurants went smoke-free. For others, when a parent died of lung cancer. For others, when the pack became too expensive. For others, it has not ended at all. The cigarette is diminished, not extinct. There is also the matter of replacement. Nicotine did not leave with the ashtray. It changed devices, flavours, batteries, language, and markets. E-cigarettes and nicotine pouches are not the same as cigarettes, and their histories are different, but they remind us that the old forces are still active. Convenience, addiction, youth appeal, anxiety relief, identity, regulation, corporate adaptation, and the search for a safer feeling way to keep using nicotine. The cigarette's fall did not end the larger story of nicotine in America. It only closed the period when burning tobacco in paper controlled the room. Looking back, the cigarette's rise can seem almost unbelievable. A product known to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans every year was once promoted by doctors, carried by soldiers, made glamorous by film stars, placed in ration kits, installed in airplanes, advertised on television, built into cars, sold from vending machines and welcomed into homes. But that is exactly why the story matters. It shows how danger can become normal when it's profitable, pleasurable, repeated, and socially approved. It shows how long it can take for evidence to overcome habit. It shows how people can know and not know at the same time. The warning label was small, but it cracked the old certainty. The lawsuits were slow, but they pulled back the curtain. The smoking bans were controversial, but they changed the air. The public health campaigns were repetitive, But repetition had built Cigarette America in the first place, and repetition helped dismantle it. The same country that learned to smoke through advertising, war, work breaks, glamour and convenience had to learn not to smoke through science, grief, policy, price, memory, and the gradual embarrassment of a habit that once looked sophisticated. So picture one last room, not a battlefield, not a courtroom, not a laboratory, not a television studio. Just an ordinary American room in 2 different years. In 1955, there are ashtrays on the table, a pack beside the lamp, a cigarette burning while no one holds it, smoke lifting toward the ceiling as people talk without noticing the haze. In the same kind of room, decades later, the ashtray is gone. The walls are cleaner, the curtains do not smell. No one asks for a light. The absence is quiet enough that a child might not know anything has changed. But something has changed. An empire once lived in that smoke. And slowly, label by label, lawsuit by lawsuit, ban by ban, cough by cough, funeral by funeral, and choice by choice, the room learned to breathe without it.